make public comment. That would be you, definitely. Would you like to make public comment?
But we're not the public yet.
No, this is the. Okay. Anybody online? I can't see. So there's different-
And I don't have the ability to do the
If
chat.
you would like to make a public comment currently, you need to put your name and address in the chat.
Chat not open.
Let me see. I didn't have it a second ago. Let me see. I've got it. It's open.
Okay, seeing no public comment, we will close that and we can close the chat for now. Thank you. We're keeping this very easy. Chairman's report. We all good?
Yes, sir.
Chairman's report. I am going to invite, it's only been 1 week, very little has happened. I'm going to invite Chris to read from our protocol. 2 bullets, because the first one is very short.
So I just want to reiterate again that we agree to our positions that will not be used for any personal gain, and that we'll be conducting business through meetings with a set agenda that is tied to district goals. Emerging items shall be addressed in subsequent meetings through planned agenda items.
Thank you very much. And the final part of my chairman's report is just that I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that today is the 10-year anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary School, where 20 students and 6 adult staff were lost. And so I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge that the brief moment of silence. Thank you. Consent agenda. Let's see, we have no minutes in this consent agenda. So this is to approve the warrants for vouchers 1024, 1025, and 1026, which we received in our packet. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Avi, did any questions come in that you?
I don't believe I received any questions.
Pretty simple. No discussion? I'm having a hard time understanding. Okay, are you guys good?
I for discussion. Sorry, I have it.
Okay. Then we will move forward with the vote. We're in discussion. All in favor of approving the consent agenda?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstain? One abstain. Okay, so we have 5 in favor, 1 abstain. Motion carries. Thank you. Subcommittee reports. Elementary, the facilities we have not met. Avi, did you have anything you needed to report out on? So yeah, no. But we do have a lot there. Finance subcommittee, we have not met. So that's good, but we do, again, for the public, have a collaboration meeting on Monday, 12/19. Policy subcommittee, who's taking those on? Okay, so are we not doing the second read done tonight again? No. We're not, okay. And negotiation. Negotiation committee met last week. It was a productive session and us, but we still good. Excellent. Thank you. That brings us to our superintendent's report.
I'm trying to fix the tech problem. I really only have, well, 2 things. I reported out to a couple of people at Ready that CPAC is starting to reboot itself. They go off to a slow start. Some changes with membership, but I know that Alpha College has sent out an email to all interested parties trying to restart that group. So that should be starting up again in the new year. And then I just want to plug the winter conference schedule that's coming up. There's something tomorrow, the high school concerts tomorrow night, Essex on Friday morning, Memorial in school on the 20th, and then there's a special chorus rock band concert the night of the 22nd. I have a talk tonight if you're available. Please come out. And we'll be ending next week with a half day on the 23rd for holiday break. So it's getting pretty festive around here. Looking forward to underway. And things are okay.
Excellent.
So it's a short one this week.
then we can rush through executive session because we have 14 minutes before we can start our public hearing.
Well, related to the public hearing, I can share that I was also at a meeting, if I can keep talking. I was also.
Fill the space. I can fill the space.
No, this is, I was gonna mention it during, the presentation, but in case I forget, I was at a session of the North Shore Roundtable's, principals this afternoon. We had a subgroup focused on special ed, particularly special ed costs and structures. So we met with a small group of legislative boards, to talk about the 14% increase in tuition and just, lobby them for some relief. No commitments, but they're hearing the concern. We're not alone. Obviously, every roundtable state is lobbying for the same things, but we're also talking about, similar to the Foundation Formula Review Commission that came to be about 10 years ago, we are working for a chapter 71 review. So pulling together a group, starting a series of hearings as kind of a second, like short term, is there a financial solution that they can help us with long term? It's a system that has a lot of antiquated systems, and I think it's just time for a review, and it's 50 years old. So more to come on that. But I think the message being that we are lobbying hard for any economic relief that we can get from the state. But it was made pretty clear to us that despite the millionaire's tax going through, any benefit is at least a year away, that is factoring in this year. The other thing we communicated to them is if you kind of just look at headlines throughout the state, there seems to be a perception that all schools have a ton of COVID relief money. Schools represented there today were basically all the regional schools were well represented, but they're also small schools with property tax based budgets. And we were very adamant that we did not get money from SOA and we did not get a large amount of dollars from ESSER, and they went to immediate needs, and we were careful not to build funding. So we communicated those messages on behalf of our council. So that's what I have, unless you have any questions about other things.
That question?
Open. You do two things at once.
Yeah.
So I think our next finance committee is until nine. Also long time in between. And then by night, we'll actually need to pick to see if we want to, if there's a package or not. Like, it depends on what the towns are saying, right?
I don't think we'll be there on January 9th yet. I think probably on, well, you should speak to this. I think that at our next finance subcommittee meeting, we'll still be looking at vouchers and we'll be looking at any updates to the budget because that's like,
I think I'm asking when are we gonna dive into the
Yeah, I was gonna say that, I think, just because that 10th is a little earlier than it's been, I can't recall if it's on the school committee agenda for this year, whether we roll out the detailed model.
Hi all, can everyone hear us?
Actually saved by the red line on it.
Jody, can you hear us?
Yes, I can now.
Thank you. You can shut your camera.
Oh, I did have it.
Then it'll just be the
Thank
me.
you.
Do we want to just say that we're
Yep.
in a holding pattern? Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
for everyone that's online, we're just in a holding pattern right now. We finished our main school committee business meeting a few minutes early, and we'll be starting the next part of our meeting in 5 minutes at 7 p.m. When I was listening last week, or was it last week or 2 weeks ago, when I wasn't able to make it, it was definitely, I don't know, there was video, there was sound, there wasn't sound, there was video,
Mhm.
it was,
It dropped a couple of times right in the middle,
yeah,
so
it was inconsistent, yeah.
And that's the live, what is the video, that's your replay?
It was both. The owl definitely has challenges.
it was the wireless was dropping
Um,
because I remember it stopped, it spun, it hung. We had trouble getting it going,
Gotcha.
so.
I know, There's also a movie night for the middle school kids this Friday.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Oh, there is.
Yeah, it's like a free movie night. They're doing pizza and drinks. And then I think the movie is The Parent Trap.
Should we crash then? Fun.
On
Do
Friday?
you want to? Friday night, yeah, I mean, it sounds like a nice little Friday night, yeah.
It'd be funny to watch them.
My son did not want me
I
to.
would say it'd be funny to watch them react to us walking in the room, like, got my hot tamales. Scoot over. Beautiful. It feels like a long time between meetings, but it's really only typical to 8 days, 10 days. Yeah.
You guys are not working in Christmas break, are you?
We will, I guess we can do it.
Get that.
Oh, good. There are people. I just can't see them. Okay, it is 7 o'clock. We are officially beginning the public hearing section of our meeting. Welcome to everyone who's here in person and welcome to everyone who has joined us virtually. Thank you for being here. And so the way this will work is that first we'll have a presentation by Pam and Avi, I believe probably together. We'll offer their presentation and then we will have a chance for public input and questions and dialogue on this. We will start with the people who are in the room. Well, we'll start with the committee if there are any clarifying questions. And then we'll go to anybody who's in the room. And then we'll also make sure that we engage anybody virtually. But just in terms of order of operations for what to expect, people online just recognize that that's the order we'll go in. All right.
And we'll try to be brief, but there's been some changeover in the committees, so we'll take it from the top. If I feel like I say this every time, if it's dragging and you're like, we've been down this road before, just kind of give me a visual signal and we can move some things along. But we did kind of just bake in a few history slides, a few methodology slides, just so everybody has a common understanding of how we go about putting this together. So I think first thing to declare is this is what we call the tentative budget. The tentative budget is a preliminary look, a forecast really of what we think the FY '24 budget will be when we finalize it in February. Probably is worth noting that we are very early in our budget process. A typical test. A typical process has the budget being finalized end of March, beginning of April. For us, we need to be prepared a month ahead of the first town meeting, which is Manchester. So our budget finalization date is February 7th. And that's well before any of our healthcare actual numbers or our state revenue numbers are known. Typically, we don't know those until April. Healthcare late March, April, and then state revenues for transportation and Chapter 70. We sometimes don't even know those until the end of June. So a lot of this is built on past looks, understanding the formulas. Avi's a whiz at creating models. So our numbers are solid estimates. We're also in unpredictable times, so we don't really, sometimes they throw us curveballs that are in our favor. Sometimes we get a curveball that that trips us up, but our job over the next couple of months is to continue to regularly monitor those numbers, make adjustments, and make people aware of any changes along the way. So we start our budget just a little bit on the methodology on how we build the budget. So with everything that we do, we don't always talk about it as much as we should, but our budget, the first thing we consider are our goals, and it looks like we're going to have a little bit of a spacing problem here. What if you use decreasing? All right, just give me 1 second before we launch into this.
While we're dealing with this technical difficulty, members of the public, you are welcome to help yourself over the course of the evening to our stash of candy canes, should you so need. Just throw a pile at Abby already.
I'm just going to leave it smaller on the screen so I can manipulate it, because otherwise the slides will fall. So sorry about that. The size will be smaller. So, right? Right, goals, link to the strategic plan. And there's a hierarchy. So we have a strategic plan that maps out our goals.
Some people have a quorum. They need to call to order. Can we allow that?
So the Essex Board of Selectmen does, we're not on the forum, but I will call the Essex Board of Selectmen. Do you want to call to order just in case?
No.
Okay.
I think you have some online though. You have at least online.
Yes.
Hey, Ruth, so this is Guy. I see both Peter and I are online.
Yeah, we're called to order, guys, so that we have the opportunity to speak during this public hearing as a governmental body. So we're all set. We were looking to see if there was a quorum of the Manchester Board of Selectmen and the Essex Finance Committee. It doesn't look as though we have that yet.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah.
Who from the Manchester Board of Selectmen is online?
So we see Kathy Bellata.
Oh, okay. In that case, we should call ourselves to order.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry to
No
cut you
problem.
off. Thank you.
We'll pretend like we're starting all over.
Yeah.
So background on our budget, we always have as the backdrop, our strategic priorities, our school committee goals, and our district and school improvement plans. All things tied together, building off of the strategic vision, and then articulated at each level through goals and plans. So that's the backdrop. Our budget, even though we should spend a lot of time talking about dollars and cents, ultimately is the way in which we provide for the education of the students, the program that they receive and the support of the faculty that delivers it. So we'll go right in and we're gonna spend a lot of time on numbers, but just keep in mind that always we are working to deliver on our plan, which in a nutshell is designed to expand our capacity to reach learners of all styles in a more effective way so that they have greater access to the curriculum and can achieve at a higher level. So that's what we're seeking to support with any of our budgets, and that is the backdrop by which we work. Knowing that the budget goes to support program, teaching and learning and student needs, we also work with a set of budget goals. If you've seen these before, see some people in the back, probably know these by heart by now. We try to be fiscally responsible in what we do. We're not putting out a budget that it tries to achieve all of our wants. We try to look at a balance of wants and needs, and always looking internally first to see if there's an investment we want to make, if there's a program we want to expand. Is there something that we're doing in districts that's antiquated or can be done more efficiently so that we can find our own funding mechanism for improvements or changes? The key driver among all key drivers, it goes back to meeting students' needs, is it's a district. I think it came through in the strategic plan. It comes through in almost any conversation I have with people about potential changes to our system. Class size, right? We're a system that has the benefit of very reasonable class sizes. They're articulated in benchmarks that were approved by the school committee many, many years ago. There's been checks on them along the way. They aren't necessarily scientific, but they are compatible and comparable with other districts of our socioeconomic background and size and caliber. And they strive on average from grade 3 to 12 to have class sizes of about 19 to 22 students. At the younger ages, we're looking for about 17 to 19 in the early childhood. So everything we're doing with our budget, when we're trying to balance inputs, make adjustments, find efficiencies, we're always going to keep in mind hitting those benchmarks. It isn't a perfect science. We are a small district, so sometimes you need to offer the French 4 class that only has 10 students in it, but it's important because it's necessary for that group of kids to have that capstone course in order to meet their post-graduation goals. Likewise, at the elementary, we strive for the 22 benchmark. It doesn't always break perfectly, so sometimes you'll have a class that's a little bit higher or a little bit lower than benchmark. We're always trying to calibrate and balance. Other piece that fits in here that doesn't adhere to the strict benchmarks for general ed classes, or we have class size numbers that pertain specifically to some of our in-district programs and specialized special ed programs. Typically, those may be a 1:6 or 1:8 student to teacher ratio. So sometimes you need 2 teachers for a class of 12 in order that we are able to deliver services and meet compliance. So a lot of time and attention spent on managing enrollment, and we're going to talk a little bit about something that's been raised over the past few years, the declining enrollment. So we have a demographic decline. We've lost 200 plus students over the past few years. It has had an impact and allowed us to make some attrition-based and enrollment cuts. Those are cuts that are made to the program that don't impact the service level. They don't impact class size. They don't impact breadth of program because we have fewer students, so we need fewer adults at times to deliver the program. So we're gonna spotlight some of those coming up. And then fiscal responsibility, but also knowing that we have to meet local and federal mandates, and our state mandates come often without any financing. So sometimes things we're being asked to do to fulfill state guidelines are just direct adds to the program that we all have to figure out how to fund. Guiding principles. With a lot of folks in this room, we have talked about historically trying to bring the budget in around the 3.5 assessment mark, which means looking at our annual growth and trying to keep it at a manageable and stable rate. So stability and manageability are 2 important things to us. So we're chasing our initiatives and goals. We're building a budget to support them, but we're also trying to exercise fiscal responsibility and be mindful to our partners that we are as efficient as possible and as stable as possible so that you can multi-year plan and know how to predict what we're going to do. Just a quick snapshot, we have remained right around the 3 to 3.5 mark back to FY17 and even before that. And a lot of the discussion we'll get into and we'll go back and forth with over the next few weeks has less to do with our rate of growth, less to do with how that rate of growth factors through the apportionment formula and impacts each town in each year. So more to come on that in a bit.
While Pam changes slides, if you're at home, and could you please make sure that your microphone is muted? Thank you.
So just very quickly, some key terms, because I've already started mentioning these, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We'll talk tonight about spending growth, and that's our percent of spending increase from year to year. So we spent $100 last year, we're going to spend $150 next year. That's our spending growth. The assessment growth is the amount of spending that's passed on to the town. So we have revenues outside of the town's assessment number. We get down 70, we get transportation, we have other revenues in the form of school choice. Anything that comes in outside of the town is deducted from the spending growth. So we have our annual growth number. We deduct all outside sources of funding, and the remainder is what is passed on to the towns for apportionment. That's the assessment growth. Apportionment formula is the formula within the regional agreement that determines, based on the assessment growth number, how that number is then divided between the two towns. We know roughly that it breaks somewhere around 65-35, give or take, in most years. Level services, just for clarity, I alluded to it a bit earlier. It's provision of the same program scope, class size, course offerings, and services from one year to the next. It doesn't mean we do everything exactly the same. Okay. Last year we got caught up in a big discussion. We did make a program reduction. It ended up being Spanish at the elementary level. What really happened was we reduced an elective option, or a specials option rather, for elementary students. So we reduced the number of specials that the kids had per week. It so happens that the reduction was made of Spanish. So they go to one less special during the week this year. We can debate whether it was good or bad. We can debate whether something else should go in its place, but that would be an under-level services budget, right? So we had to take an offering away. We had to reduce the scope of the program. Sometimes we get caught up on what it is and forget that really it's a shrinkage of opportunity for kids. When we're making level services reductions or enrollment reductions, we're not tampering with the breadth or scope of the program, but we may make changes within. And then reserves, we'll do a little bit, we have a significant number of slides dedicated to reserves. Those are funds that are accumulated over fiscal years. They're intended to be rainy day funds for emergencies, planned capital investments, one-time expenditures, emergency expenditures. And their third purpose really is to be a marker of our financial health and a demonstration of sound financial practice, which when you go to borrow allows you to get more favorable rates. That plays in heavily when you go out to do the Memorial School project and the upcoming Essex Elementary project. So having healthy reserves serves a lot of purposes. Over the past few years, we've been using them as in operating, and we're going to talk about why our budget is built to exclude reserves as revenue this year. Just a quick snapshot. Our budget has a couple of components. We'll talk tonight about all three, the operating, well, both the operating and the capital, and we will talk about reserves, which is actually a funding mechanism, not a component of the budget. But mostly when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about operating. When we're talking about level services, we're talking about operating. And this just demonstrates that the primary focus of our operating dollars goes to the core program, and investments and enhancements we try to manage creatively. Now we're ready to, any questions on kind of the background and methodology before we jump into the overview? So 5 key points. The budget is a carry forward level services budget. It strives to support strategic plan priorities. It includes right sizing for enrollment. So the budget includes the reduction of 4 FTE or full-time staff members, unassigned at this time, but we know based on our numbers that we're able to achieve that without impacting level service. It eliminates reserves from the budget. And it has generated a deficit of $756,000 between spending and revenue. And that's what we're going to be calling the gap from here on out. What it doesn't include,
Sorry, can you just step through that last piece one more time?
Sure.
Bottom line, because I think that's important, but kind of like that.
Yep, the level services budget right now is missing $756,000 in revenue. If we assume that the assessment is at 3.5% growth for next year,
And that's with the 4 FTEs.
that's including a reduction of 4 heads. Yep,
And you said something previously about, you gave the level services example. You gave the example of eliminating the elementary Spanish position. So that's an example of
not
No.
meeting.
not meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, just.
So our budget last year was built at this time to be a level services budget. By the time we got to the end of the process, we dipped below level services.
So 4 LTEs removed is not affecting services, but then there's a 756K.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And just to round up the top level, what we didn't include in the budget, and I think this might further clarify, is we didn't include any reinstatement. So we're not, there are lines in our budget that have been trimmed over time to help achieve our target number of 3.5. Things like our capital fund, we have a small capital line. It should be $100,000. It's been reduced over time. I think it sits at about 50 or 60 right now. But those are for things like summer projects, painting projects, needing new desks or equipment, needing to do repairs to the facility. So it's a facilities line. We didn't put back any of the program reductions or staffing reductions that we had last year. We haven't included a stabilization contribution. Stabilization fund is a fund dedicated to facilities needs, so capital improvements. We were able to fund healthily the stabilization. We created and funded a stabilization fund when we pulled the loan for the memorial school. The interest on that loan went into that fund. And there was discussion among all parties at the time that that money would be first and foremost earmarked for parity among 2 elementary schools. Knowing full well we couldn't rebuild the building with that money, but we could ensure that if brand new technology went into the memorial school, Essex would have equal technology in that school. And that's how we've been using those funds over time. The investments in Essex have reduced that fund. We have talked about, but not included, an annual allotment to stabilization to build the fund systematically over time. So we're always building an emergency facilities fund. It's a concept, it's not included. There's also been discussion about whether or not it would be appropriate to include a number to put money back into reserves. So return to reserves the amount of money that was spent out of reserves as a line of revenue in operations. These are theoretical questions right now. These numbers aren't in the budget, but to the question that was asked earlier, if you were to add anything from this list in, that $756,000 number will increase. So any new adds will increase that unless we can find an offset to decrease it. So this is part of the discussion that the school committee will have over the next few weeks as to whether or not these things need to find their way into the budget. Going to kick it over to Avi. Typically I do the big picture pieces and Avi is the numbers guy. So I'm going to have him walk you through the nuts and bolts of the operating budget.
Sure. Thanks, Pam.
Yep.
And, I think we've talked about on a multi-year basis how maintaining level services just at the run rate that grows, which can be around 3.5%, sometimes up towards 4%, not just for MERC, but most districts when you listen to how school systems tend to grow on a basic carry forward basis, that can cause a conflict with levy limits. And so over time, that gap between those two can tend to grow. And that's what the left half is talking about. Pam's already addressed the 756 being that gap. So moving into the budget, we have a 30.14 million tentative budget on the operating side, excluding debt service and capital budget, which we'll talk about later. And you can see some of the biggest categories. These tend to be pretty stable from year to year, but gives you a sense of where the funding goes. And if you just take the 2 biggest categories, which are people and the benefits and pension, et cetera, that's around just around 81% of the budget, just to give you a sense. The largest 5 categories are really about 95% of the spending. So it really helps to kind of simplify in some ways what we're talking about.
Bobby, could you speak up a little bit so
Sure.
everybody?
Yeah. How am I doing in the back? Bro, can you hear me okay? I did this recently, sorry. So just looking at some of the items that are in there, I'll try and talk louder. Thanks, Jake. Compensation, number one biggest category. It's about a 2.8% growth rate. That's lower than the typical level services that you would see, which is typically right around the high threes, low 4% range. And that relates to the fact, as Pam mentioned, that there's a 4.0 full-time equivalent FTE reduction in there. But when you look at some of the major categories of who we have in personnel, teachers, right now, what we're budgeting is the same thing we've had in the budget for the past couple of years, which is a 2.5% cost of living adjustment on top of the contracted mandated step increases that people get for additional years of service. Those documents are in our public budget documents, so you can see what those step increases are. We are in the middle of going through a negotiation process. But what we have in there is a placeholder based on where we've been, and the 2.5% rate has been the same for 4 straight budget cycles. So it is certainly a kind of a status quo type of an assumption. Moving along, teaching assistants, I think the number is about 40 full-time equivalents that we have, primarily in special education. And the assumption in there is the same 2.5% COLA. Some of them do get steps too. There's only 4 steps. About 3/4 of those folks are already on the maximum steps. But when you roll in the growth of the people who are moving through, you get to a number of around 4.2%. Again, this is a much smaller component of the budget relative to staffing of teachers. And all other staff, that number has been growing straight at 2.5, but none of them have steps or anything else. It's just a salary number. And what we've seen over many years of having 2.5%, say 4 years in a row, with steps added in for the groups of the top 2 groups, that as the bottom group has been just a 2.5, there's been kind of a multi-year divergence that is creating some anomalies that kind of throw pay scales out of whack. So this is the first year out of the past 4 where we've brought that COLA number up to be equated to the actual growth of the top 2 categories at 4%.
Okay.
Yep. Moving along to the next biggest category, which is insurance and non-META pension. There is no pension in the state of Massachusetts for people in the Teachers Association. That's picked up by the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth assumes the employer share of pension for all teachers and licensed personnel. We only have pension for non-licensed personnel. And as we talked about, over the years, now that we no longer have in-service, in-house food service or transportation or custodial to a large extent, that has also mitigated our pension costs. So it's primarily health insurance that we're talking about when we're looking at this category. But there is a small contribution to pension relative to the others. Right now, we're looking at a higher than typical rate of 12% as a rate adjustment. But that's based on what we're hearing from brokers in the marketplace, based on current market averages in the post-COVID era of 8 to 12%. Basically, in most years, you see about 6 to 8% being the average range. And if you're performing better than average, you can get a number lower than 6 to 8%. So let's say your claims aren't that high, you can do better. And if your claims are doing worse, you might be above the 6 to 8%. But in the current year, with inflation hitting so many different areas of the budget, including medical costs, those are the numbers that are being seen in the marketplace, and our advisors are saying that's the average. So we're at the high end now. From a budgetary standpoint, part of the reason is that we continue to monitor monthly data of how we're doing. And at this point, we're still looking at only a month or 2 of data since teachers have come on, or staff have returned. So it's a little premature to really be making a fiscal 24 type of estimate at this point. So we start conservative. Reason being that it's very hard to raise your number as you go through the budget cycle without with this being 20% of your budget without having a dramatic impact. So big picture, we're hoping that this number could improve. We're going to monitor on a month-by-month basis, and we might get 1 to 2 more months of data prior to school committee adopting the budget, maybe 2 to 3 by the time these budgets go to finalization prior to town meetings. And as Pam mentioned, while typically we get a final number in late March, very latest early April prior to open enrollment, which is April 15th. So I showed a little bit about how, if the numbers come down at percent of the time, that's about 43,000 per percent, based on the fact that it's about $4.3 million of contribution in our budget. Moving on to out-of-district transportation and tuitions. These are for students in a special ed placement whose needs cannot be met in district, for whom we have an obligation to provide appropriate services, and for which we need to find a placement that's not in the school district. Just going down a couple bullets, we have built many in-district programs, which have helped us to offset costs significantly in this area. We save about $1.8 million a year by having in-district programs. They do cost money. The 1.8 million is after factoring in the cost of in-person, in-house staff. We still save 1.8 million after that. If we didn't have these programs, those kids would be going to an out-of-district program. They wouldn't be, having services with their peers. Here, they would be someplace else, and we would be growing our budget right off the bat by about that amount of money based on an analysis we just did last year. About 61 kids are served in district through those programs. We are seeing growth over the past 2 to 3 budget cycles in out-of-district transportation, out-of-district tuition for those who do go out. And in the past 2 budget cycles, it has been a number that has impacted our spending levels and has been kind of a budget driver that's been pretty high level. We are still continuing to see growth, about $300,000, the biggest driver of which is the fact that the state has approved a 14% rate increase for private school placements. And by private schools, I'm talking about private special education programs where we are required to send kids. And that's affecting all districts across the Commonwealth. It's a big adjustment. It's again part of this inflationary market, and that's an approved item that all private school placements can increase. So that's a big $300,000 impact to spending. However, because the state picks up a portion of high cost tuitions through its circuit breaker program, because we've had 2 to 3 years now of this being a budgetary story, we're starting to see that money, which comes in arrears in subsequent fiscal years, back to the district, that's allowing us to offset the cost growth. So even though the underlying cost drivers are going up, we're getting back that money from the state program, which is allowing the net impact to the budget to be a slight decrease. So that's a good news story there. And you can see we were getting only about $310,000 just 2 years ago on the last bullet from the circuit breaker program. That's up to $765,000 in the current year based on the preliminary numbers. Again, we get paid 1 year in arrears from the state. Transportation. Yep.
Just a question. Can you just go back? So, the main header right there says 15K increase, 0.8% spending growth.
That's right.
But you just mentioned that there was a decrease. So can you just speak?
Yeah, that's right. So it's if you look at the budget sheets that we put out on the web from last meeting, the tuition alone is about 80,000 down. But the one thing I didn't get to on this slide, I was just about to hit, is transportation. We are required to provide transportation for kids who go out of district. So the way the tentative budget is set up, according to the regional agreement, is to show the tuitions in one area. That's the $80,000 decrease. In the 3,000 series where the transportation numbers are, that's where there's an increase for the transportation. And so the one thing which I'm glad you asked, I wanted to hit on next, is the second sub bullet here. We have a $786,000 increase over the past 3 years, 146%, 35% per year. It's a dramatic increase. And so if you're hearing stories in the news about shortage of bus drivers and that sort of thing, which is all over the place, and, for example, Boston Public Schools being down, in the 10, 70 drivers or whatever, this is also impacting out-of-district transportation, and the costs are going up significantly. And there's a shortage. So it's become a real problem, and that's why even though we're going to have some savings on the tuition side, we're still getting hit on the transportation side.
And I just want to clarify for our community in the audience, if you're going to ask a question, you need to identify your name and town, please, so that we have it for the record. Thank you. You might know all of these people, but we don't all know all of them.
I don't. I'm Avi. Nice to meet you.
Back here, I like an avenue manager.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question. All right. And I think we're getting close to the end. Yep. So big picture, what do the numbers mean now that we've looked at the major drivers? It's about 30.1 million. It's a 4.2% spending growth number. Okay, that's what's happening with spending before you figure out who's paying for it and how the funding works. Okay, we talked about how about 2/3 of our budget is the personnel. That's the 2.8%. The operating expenses, the rest, that's 6.6, and you blend those two at 2/3 and 1/3. That's how you get to 4.2%. Again, the health insurance being a 12% rate increase as a preliminary estimate, which is the high end of what we're being advised, but I think is a conservative number. I think that would, if we were able to bring that down, that would bring the 4.21% number down to potentially below 4. What does this mean for the towns after you back out non-town revenue? It's a 6.5% increase. Why so much of a difference? Well, the biggest issue is that we're not using any rainy day one-time reserve funds as a revenue source. In the past several budget cycles, we have been helping to cover spending using our rainy day funds as a way to suppress the charge to the towns through the assessment, as a way to understand that it would at some point potentially run into Proposition 2.5 limits. And so trying to not cut the program any further, keep spending where it is, but also not trying to push the town assessments over the levy limit. That's where use of reserves has been a short-term strategy that we're talking about trying to fix with this budget. How are we doing that? By not using reserves as a revenue source. What does that do? It means that the towns have to pick up a bigger percentage of the spending. That's why that number is going up 6.5%. This is some of the other revenue items that don't come from the town. I mentioned that with the $520,000 removal of reserves, that's reserves that we committed in fiscal 23. We're not committing any to fund the budget in 24. That's a decrease of 520, but there's a slight increase to offset that from state aid based on minimal per pupil assumptions that we saw in the most recent fiscal year. That nets out to $413,000. We did see a pretty good year for general ed transportation reimbursements last year, but part of that was a reimbursement from the COVID phase where we didn't have any non-reimbursable students. We believe that number will come down. You may remember in COVID, we only provided service to kids who are 1.5 miles or further. That's the reimbursable range for what the DESE, the Department of Ed, will pay for. They only want to pay for kids who are going a certain distance or beyond 1.5 miles. So during COVID, to keep kids spaced out, we didn't offer any bus service for kids who were riding closer. We brought that back as the restrictions started to get loosened, and as a result, we expect less reimbursement from the state. Yep. This just shows a summary of the highest cost, and 95% being the biggest areas, and we really talked about them. The only other area that we didn't really touch on in detail, which is a smaller dollar increase, but is on the slide here, that we presented in some of our notes, is on the maintenance side. And I think there are two major areas of maintenance that are a little bit different this year than what we've seen. If you followed the current year, fiscal 23 budget to actual update that we provided to school committee in November, we talked about the fact that utilities are certainly going through the roof. I think everyone knows that there's a war and that there's an energy crisis and that it's impacting everyone. We were in the situation where when COVID first happened, we locked in very favorable rates when the market was tanking. Those rates are coming, those contracts are coming due for renewal, and we're going from a really great situation to a terrible situation. And so we had a $185,000 current year budget adjustment to pay for what we're anticipating in the current year, and some of that will roll through into fiscal 24 as we have a full 12 months of new contracts there. It's still projected. That is a number we're going to be monitoring over the next couple of months, working with our energy consultant Power Options. The other small area of maintenance that is worth mentioning is just that we continue to see smaller but noticeable increases in the amount of money to handle routine maintenance at Essex Elementary. Yeah, I think if you've been listening to our budget presentations, or if you came to the November 15th meeting where we had our preliminary unveiling of the facility condition index for Essex Elementary and middle school, high school, it's a very old building. It's about the same age as the old memorial school. It had to go second in the order because it was in better condition, but it's, at some point when you have a building at that age, you're starting to put a little bit more money year after year. We've talked a lot, including in our current budget year cycle, how we've been upping our preventative maintenance investments, which are costly, but help to elongate the life of useful assets. And so that's part of our strategy, especially at this building, which is only 10 years old. It's in good condition. Things are going well, but we have been investing in preventative maintenance programs, more, routine inspections. You can catch little things, not have them turn into big things. That costs money. I think, 7 to 10 years ago when we started here, we weren't doing that much of that. We were much more a reactive mode. So the budget has increased a little bit, but the major repair needs have gone down. And so I think that that's been a very favorable trade-off. All right, reserves.
Any quick questions on operating?
Can we just get to the end and then we'll go in an orderly fashion?
All right, reserves. Do you want me to keep going?
I'll do the top tier. You want to take them through the numbers?
Sure.
So what we tried to do, obviously, reserves is, we're including it as a component of the budget because over the past few years, we've been using it as a source of revenue, but we want to clarify what its intended purpose is and why, if we continue the practice of using it as revenue, it's going to jeopardize the totality of our budget, which not only includes operating, but also includes our capital investments and our hope to go forward rather quickly with pursuing an Essex Elementary replacement. So just kind of in a nutshell, reserves, rainy day funds, different names for them, is accumulated financial resources accumulated from budgets, underspending your budget, revenues that come in the form of school choice. Sometimes they come in tuition. So basically, at the end of the year, if we have excess dollars, they go into one of 4 accounts, which we're going to walk you through in a minute. The way we look at reserves is one-time money available for 3 key purposes. Planned capital investments, so something like the turf fields, which we're on track to address this coming summer, or something like the EES feasibility study. So when we did memorial feasibility, we paid for the district's portion of feasibility through reserves. It's a one-time investment in a capital project. We intend to do the same with EEF, but we need to have reserves available to do that. Emergency expenditures. It's been brought up several times that on the road to a building project, anything can happen in an aged building. We saw that happen at Memorial School. So while we were waiting for the Memorial School project to get underway, we had to replace a major water line that went bad, that we learned that we owned the bill for. So that was a $300,000 unexpected investment in 1 year. And then in the next year, I believe was the next year, the boiler failed. We have to keep the building until we replaced it. So having healthy reserves puts us in a good position if those things darken our doorstep. And then third, and a little bit more theoretical, but still equally important, is having a healthy reserve fund. And we call healthy the 10% mark, 10% of our operating budget. It allows for us to maintain a good bond rating because it demonstrates that we have sound financial practices, and all of that translates into a better borrowing position. So we get a more favorable rate when we go out for something like the Essex Elementary School. Obviously, we can't change the conditions that exist in the market at the time, but it's put us in the best position to manage those. So just starting with a basic definition of what they are and how we see them and why we become concerned when we start moving beyond just a bridge situation, a one-time use of reserves to get through a short financial period and start to use them as a routine source of revenue. If we use them as a routine source of revenue, you're going to see as we progress through this section, it depletes your reserves and puts you in a vulnerable position to manage things as they come down the pike.
Yeah, and just to add on the debt rating and the credit rating, the other thing it allowed us to do with the middle high school is refinance 2 rounds of debt at significant savings to taxpayers. So by keeping our credit rating low, sometimes after you get to that that optionality period after 10 years where you can look at maybe a 30-year bond, if you've got a good credit rating and your reserves are stable, you can, we saved, I think, about $2 million on one and about $1.3 million on another issue. So a lot of money that really just comes back to taxpayers to the extent that we're able to keep that savings there. It's visible. We're currently rated by S&P. They look at our publicly traded debt.
So that's how we use them. We often get the question, what are these accounts? So we have we call them the reserves, and the reserves are made up of 4 sub-accounts. Avi, you want to take them through?
Sure. The excess and deficiency account is managed and certified by the Department of Revenue in our annual end of year presentations to them. And it basically keeps track of accumulated savings from your operating budget over time. Facilities rental, we have had a facilities rental program over the past several years where we, as private groups come in, we can make a little bit of money bit by bit over time. You think of, groups like the Cape Ann Symphony that come into our auditorium, groups that use our fields on the weekends, et cetera. And so we have accumulated surplus from rental fees there. The school choice fund, we are a district that receives school choice students. These are students who reside in other towns, but can come here if we have available spaces. The school committee decides every year what we have for available spaces. And to the extent that there's any accumulated surplus from what we get from the Department of Revenue, that would sit in that fund. And stabilization, Pam discussed before, which is a specific fund dedicated towards facility improvements. We had, for those who may not know, when we borrowed money for the Memorial School project, we did do one big borrowing up front of $35 million. And while that money was awaiting deployment bit by bit, month by month, spending money on construction, we were earning interest income that was pretty significant. And net of the project, we earned about $980,000 that has funded several major capital improvements, most notably investments in Essex Elementary to keep a level of equity in the building facility, in the technology that's in the building, in the playground, things that we could use the memorial funds from interest income to make sure that the 2 elementary schools are getting as much of an equal type of experience as possible, given that the buildings are clearly much different at this point.
So we've defined how we use them, what accounts we have, and now just a quick look at what we're committed to, what the reserves are committed to in the coming years.
Right. So this is an update that we provided to school committee in the fall in one of our end of fiscal 22 reviews, where you could look at the bottom line number, forecast number of $3.1 million. We're still waiting for the E&D number to be certified, but you can see some of the makeups of those items. Basically, I would say the biggest change is that the stabilization account, what I mentioned, was close to $1 million. We are definitely spending that down. We put in the Essex Playground. That was $350,000. We put in a good bit of technology and security investments. You can see some of the items, and we're using that fund as well to do the architectural design work for the turf fields that we're trying to move forward on quickly, as well as the facility condition assessment through the Habib report. So other than that, there isn't a significant amount of change on this page.
So just to give you a sense of where we are now, and if we go through with our commitments, where we'll be at the end of summer 24.
Yeah, and the biggest change that you can see here is that if you look at the facilities rental number being used, 270, and the stabilization using the rest there, and the school choice, really the biggest numbers there is about of the 1.494 that you see being spent, 1.2 million of that is turf field replacement, of which we're dealing with an $800,000 field at 100% investment and another $800,000 at a 50% investment because it's a shared use asset with the town of Manchester. So that's really the biggest change there. The remainder of the 1.494 are the items that we showed on the prior slide of how we're intending to continue to use stabilization for these projects that we've already mentioned. So I think the headline on a percentage basis is you're going from just over 10, just under 11% of your budget being in reserves, which is kind of a pretty good benchmark for best practice, down to half of that in a short amount of time for planned spending that is really good spending to be doing. This is replacing assets that need to be replaced. It's doing that without sending a bill back for a special assessment to towns. So I think everyone can be glad about that, but clearly it is going to be changing the financial position such that, why are we talking about this? This is all the reason why it does not make sense to be using reserve funds to also supplement a budget gap between spending and revenue, especially when spending has been very stable over time. And we've really been suppressing town assessments to make sure we don't trip the levy limit. It's time to stop using the one-time funds. And that's why the current fiscal 24 budget has removed that 520,000. You can see we don't really have money to be doing that much longer. It would take 5.3% to even lower if we continued that practice.
So this is just a recap of where the dollars are intended to be going over the next year. So Highland Field replacement, Brook Street, and then I think just a.
Right.
So
So
then one last piece of our budget is just the capital budget. Go, sorry, I just wanted.
that's
to
okay.
transition.
So the capital budget is a separate vote, separate budget. If you go to town meeting in Manchester, they vote it separately. In Essex, it's part of the vote for debt service. And that is just for debt service. All the revenue comes from towns. There's no state aid revenue that pays for debt service. And it's all known in advance. Every time we go out with an issue, we have the 30-year trajectory of what it's going to cost. And when those bills come due, it's very predictable. Generally, the bills have been structured in level principles. So that means that the amounts of payments when you factor in interest go down each year, which was done intentionally. You pay a little bit more upfront, but you save a lot of money over the life of the bonds. That structure was really devised by the towns collaborating with the district because the towns are funding this. All of the debt service is 100% excluded from the levy limit. How did that happen? When we voted the project for the middle school, high school, and when we voted the memorial project, those went to town meeting, special town meeting votes, where voters said we approve the budget, 49 million for this building, 52 million for memorial, and we also approve borrowing that will be excluded from Proposition 2.5. So that's why this is in the standalone budget. It really doesn't impact the levy limit, but it costs money. We are seeing that the continued decline of as we pay off the bills. That's why we're seeing a fiscal 24 number that's 338,000 or 7.5% lower than fiscal 23. We are rolling off one big slice of debt, which was the $1.96 million borrowing for this building. It was the last borrowing we had. So that's final payment is made in the current fiscal year. We won't have that in 24, so that's why that's rolling off. So, yep, go ahead.
Nope, go back. So under the capital banner is also the game plan for Essex Elementary. I think we've touched on this a couple of times, but just to recap, we had our initial facilities report. It focused on Essex Elementary and the middle high school. It laid out potential need for investment over the next 10 years. I think the walk away, again, to say the headline of the report is that Essex Elementary has passed its useful life. We would need to be making significant investments almost immediately to maintain it and keep it in a condition suitable for teaching, which has us thinking about the timeline for submitting a statement of interest to MSBA to begin that process of pursuing studying what our options are with Essex Elementary. We had mapped this out several years ago, and originally we had called 2023 the fast track. Looking like it was probably a conservative guess at the time, but you can just see that if we were to apply, and we believe we will be recommending that in the first of the year, that we apply for our initial statement of interest into the Mass Building Authority in April of this year. The roll through would have us at a feasibility study in 25, a town vote for expenditure in 26. That's the full design town vote, with construction beginning in 27. So based on what we're seeing in MB, we think that's a responsible pathway forward. There will be more discussion about that. We will be seeking support from all of the boards before we go forward with submissions of an SOI, but it's pretty clear from the initial discussion with Habib that that's the recommended course of action. And we mentioned that specifically tonight because we're really trying to think about and encourage everybody to think about the FY24 budget, not just in terms of operating. A lot of times we'll hyper-focus on operating and then actually drill down even deeper and focus almost our entire discussion on the assessment apportionment number. And that's what impacts us, and that's the problem we have to solve. But in reality, the operating supports the overall program and day-to-day experience of the kids. So that's what's there to support our long-term goals and wants for student achievement. But our budget also has to take into account the short-term capital needs and then the long-term project needs for EES. Because if we talk just about operating, we keep landing ourselves back on using those reserves to solve that short-term problem, when we really need to broaden our scope and look at the fact that the reserves are absolutely required for the short-term capital needs and the long-term goal of replacing Essex Elementary. And if we misuse those in the operating budget, I think we're setting ourselves up for some real trouble with managing those other two pieces. Because we're going to be left, I think, very exposed by only having $1.5 million on hand to manage both a feasibility study and any potential problems along the way. That doesn't even account for something happening at the middle high school or something unforeseen. So we're trying to think about all pieces together and how they're interconnected and chart a course of action that is, you know, going back to our original goals, supports our academic goals, but also is fiscally responsible and manageable for the town. So now the hard work begins. We kind of know what the big numbers are telling us. We'll continue to sharpen the pencil and try to find ways to manage the number and keep it reasonable. But we do have to figure out how we're going to deal with removing reserves as a source of revenue. So I think that's where we can leave it tonight. And I think everyone's seen this slide. It just kind of outlines the challenge. We've spoken to this, so we don't need to rehash it. But we're here. Discussion. Happy to answer questions.
Okay, so Maria, could you open the chat? People, so let's just set expectations. Our committee, we've had a chance, well, we've seen the bulk of this presentation. We've had a chance to ask questions as well. So I will first open it up to school committee for any clarifying questions, but I would encourage us to remember that we can ask these questions all the time and leave the time as much as possible. While we're thinking on that, anybody from the public in person, if you would like to, or online, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, this is different from our regular business meeting, public comment session. If you're making a comment, you just want to offer feedback, we'd ask that you keep it to 2 to 3 minutes if possible, just to give everyone a chance here. This is different also from our regular meetings in that you will be able to engage in dialogue. There may be an answer. I would expect Pam and Avi will be actually answering most of the questions. But just keeping in mind that what I'd like to do is give everybody in person a chance to go through once before we take seconds, and then get people online to get a chance to, so that we can make sure that everybody has a chance to have their questions answered. Do you have an initial question, a procedural question, Anne?
I have a procedural, actually.
Please.
We had not posted a meeting for tonight, so I think we need to close what we have pretended to be a meeting. And the individual members of the Manchester Board of Selectmen are here representing themselves on the board, and we will not deliberate.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, so we will start with the school committee, then we'll go to people in person. Anybody online who is joining us, if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question or engage, please put your name and address in the chat. If you're joining by phone, we'll ask after we go through all the chat people if there's anybody joining by phone. So please do not use the chat function for anything other than putting your name and address in the chat for a comment. Thank you. Okay, committee, do we have any clarifying questions, or are we ready to turn this over?
We yield our time.
We yield our time, maybe. Okay. All right, so I saw a hand in the back, and then I saw a voice in the front. So I'll take the hand in the back because she was waving paper. So if you could share your name and address, please. Very dramatically.
Annie Cameron, Essex.
Thank you.
You know, this is the beginning of the year. I think kind of an exciting time of the school year. I like talking about budget. I like to fight. You know, there's tension, and it's good, and it's exciting. And I guess I just want to first say that this is a shared problem with the two towns in our district. And there's a way to approach this that is collaborative. And I hope that we approach this in a spirit of good faith. I guess I would recommend that school committee members attend the boards of selectmen meetings and finance committee meetings in each town, so that you know what's being said, and you can communicate what's happening in school committee meetings, so they can communicate back to you, so that there's no kind of miscommunication, because I think that's been an issue in the past.
That said, I just wanted to throw some questions at you and you can tell me to stop, or you can say, I'll just take them and we can go through. First, I do want to have some information from Manchester about what the police budget negotiation was. I think Essex was 2%. So I think it's hard to look at a 2.5 and ask for an override in an environment where we're asking for police to do 2. I'm wondering if you can give us some school choice in numbers, if we're increasing that at all. You know, I saw the reduction of 4 FTEs, and I'm wondering, are there any admin savings that we can look at? I mean, we have built up admin in the past few years, and I'm wondering if there's any corresponding reductions there. And it's not just admin, it's central office and, you know, in the offices. I just wondered also what the percentage savings would be on a negotiated 2.5 to 2 on the contract. I wonder, Avi, and I don't want you to talk about this yet, but is there a strategy in terms of out of district and special education? If you're getting 76% from circuit breaker, we need to look at how much is, I mean, and I'll say this knowing that we always want students to be here with their siblings and their neighbors. And, you know, we want to avoid out of district placement as much as possible, but I'm just wondering if there's a strategy where you realize some savings this year, but then we've also got the transportation costs, which I don't know if they negate that, but just wondering if there's a strategy in terms of out of district costs. And 2 other questions. Is there an opportunity to do fields on a debt exclusion in each town instead of using our reserves? And that's 1.2?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I just wonder if we can, if there's any state level relief that we might see in the Gilly administration that would help us out. I mean, I'm disappointed that Ann Margaret is our representative for Manchester and Essex now. She's not here. You know, it's always nice to have the representatives show up where this is the biggest piece of our budgets that we've had. So I know I shot you a lot. You don't have to answer all of it. These are things that if I were sitting there.
I've got them.
I was gonna say, I wrote them all down if you didn't get them, so.
Let me see how I do. Admin, we are currently doing a set of comparables with other districts. Initially, it looks like we are still understaffed in admin in comparison. That's initial look, but yes, we're studying that as well. School choice, we haven't set the numbers yet. We'll do that in January. That's going to be the fine line of balancing, making reductions based on enrollment, and then taking a look after to see if there's marginal space and not getting ourselves into a situation where we're taking in school choice for the sole purpose of raising revenue and then needing to commit resources to having those students here. So we'll do that analysis in January. OOD, I think it's always helpful sometime in January, February to have Allison in to talk about that because she's truly our expert, and we talk a lot about it in the budget as an outcome, but it's really all about the IEP process and the placement process that is blind to finance. So every student has the right to be here, and every student has the right to their best placement. And there's, you know, from your history on the committee, there's an intricate process that people go through to make those determinations. I think what we can say is we did an analysis last year, and our in-district programs are still providing savings in the terms of cost avoidance to about $1.5 million. So I think we're still continuing to build structures internally where we can to keep kids where they belong, which is in their home school. And what we're seeing in our district placement is it's our most it's cases we cannot manage or would not be fair to the student to force them to be managed here, that it's a health and safety need that requires an out-of-district placement.
Can I ask a clarifying question on that?
Yep.
You may.
I know you walked into this with a level of risk
How it goes.
on the out of district. And I wonder, you don't have to speak to it now, but I would love to hear that in the next meeting, you know, what, you know, you have risk built into this budget coming into this year. I would like to see how are we doing against those risk factors that we kind of went into into the year thinking, you know, cross our fingers and, you know, it's not a great.
I'm gonna kick it to him to talk about that.
Yeah,
after,
but
because
you don't have to answer now, but
because I think it was mitigated by the circuit breaker.
Okay, thank you.
2 versus 2.5, $76,000 per half point or 140 per point. Okay, so if you reduced it to a 222, it'd be about $150,000 to $200,000 savings, right? And then tying back to out of district placement in the state relief. I don't think you were here yet, but I was saying earlier, I was just at a meeting today with the local superintendent's subgroup. We met with Bruce and other legislators lobbying for some type of financial relief, particularly in the face of the 14% out of district tuition increase. So the North Shore group is still at it. And we're pitching it in terms of a short-term solution, which is financial relief this year, in a long-term solution, which probably goes back to your first question of OOD, which is structurally, there seems to be, we've got some structural issues with the program, very much like we had with Chapter 70 a few years ago. The statute, the process hasn't changed to keep track with the times. So can we get a commission to review it and make recommendations and try to build forward, because this is a problem that all districts are facing. You had another one in there and I missed it.
Debt exclusion.
That's just I think that's a whole group discussion about how do you want to source it? In terms of if the money comes from a special debt exclusion versus our reserves, we're prepared with the reserves because I think in our mind, kind of going to this slide, back to the slide about all the components of the budget, I think we're becoming laser focused on decisions we make on operating and short-term capital now are gonna impact our timeline and our ability to manage the Essex Elementary project. So if we think the Essex Elementary project has a potential for a large town vote as soon as 27, what's the tolerance level in each community for debt exclusions? You know, 1 year, take a year off, and then the next year. And then how are we going to handle operating? So I think all three questions need to be answered at the same time. And we're going to look to, I mean, can't speak for the committee, so they need to jump in on this too, but I'm going to look to the collaboration group. I'm going to look to people in the community to message to us kind of what the tolerance level is for the different mechanisms for funding. What we're trying to establish here is we can't do it all with what we have on hand now. So how do we best map the road so that we can make sure we're making good on all of our obligations?
My add to that would just be that the collaborative meetings that have taken place, that are taking place this year, it's been a little hard through the COVID years, and there's been a lot going on in that, but things are very positive and productive together. So problem solving together seems to be the order of the day at our collaborative group.
You want the circuit breaker?
I don't know.
Well, I just say that, in terms of when we did our first budget to actual look for fiscal 23, the out of district budget was not one that we requested a transfer in for. We felt like we can manage the current year budget with what we have. So one of your questions was about risk and how some of the projections are unfolding. Major reason is because of the circuit breaker money that's coming in above what's expected. It's also good for people who may not be as familiar with the circuit breaker program. In a sentence, state will reimburse a portion of the cost above a threshold level. Everything below the threshold level is the district obligation. And part of the implications of having in-district programs are the ones that do tend to go out at this point, tend to be higher cost placements. So you have a higher proportion rolling through that state participation. Additionally, the state did make an adjustment to start to pay for special ed out of district transportation. on a 4-year phase-in basis. So people have been talking about what a financial problem is. I showed the numbers that said our costs have gone up 145% over 3 years. We're very much seeing the same thing as other districts. That money is starting to go through the circuit breaker formula bit by bit as well. I think the fiscal 24 would be 75% of those costs would be eligible to be looked at. It's all subject to the state budget. The state doesn't allocate an increasing amount because they've got a 14% increase in rates, for example, or transportation numbers are going through the roof for all districts. They've got to increase their budget because at the end of the day, if they don't have enough to go around, we're not going to get as much. But we are for the past 2 years from, like I said, 300,000 circuit breaker up to, more than double that in fiscal 23. So that's the answer to your risk question. I think that's been working out well.
Thank you. Please.
Procedural. I think we now have a quorum from the Essex Finance Committee because Mike Flynn just joined in person, and I know Josh is up there, so we have 4. So
Great.
I'd like to make a motion to go into session of the Essex Finance Committee. All in favor? Aye.
Having a microphone.
Great. Thank you. Next in person. Go ahead, Ruth.
Ruth Green, Essex. So my first question is just a question, and I have a second one, which is going to be very educational. So my first question, looking at the tentative budget, it appears to me that our health insurance cost is around $5 million, and we're building the budget based on 12%. So my question is, when you get that final number, do we continue to hold that 12% and does it go back into the reserves, or do you decrease the overall budget by whatever the number is? Because that's obviously a huge amount of money.
Yep.
12%.
Yep. So what we've done over the past several budget years in a row is as we go through the process of from tentative budget into the weeks of January. So we just provide updates. As I get more information, I provide it to school committee, and then school committee will make a determination of what to do. So certainly in many years past, we have seen that number come down for sure. Sometimes they'll say, well, that number is coming down, but we cut this over here and we didn't want to cut that. So that might go back there. Other times they're going to say this could be used to lower the assessment. There's all different ways that can be used. And sometimes it's happened after the budget has been adopted prior to town meeting. And there still has been the opportunity for school committee to deliberate and make a decision about what to do. So all of those things have happened in the past. And typically by the time we get to the later phases of budget, there's been a lot of discussion of all the things that are being, I would say, efficiencies, reductions, and cuts, as well as areas of needed investment. And so the school committee, from my observation, tends to have a process, very much public discussion about what to do with any savings that materialize and where they go.
Thank you. So from an educational kind of question for me, slide 2, key terms. So Kim, when you were talking about that slide, you mentioned we were talking about spending growth and assessment growth. And you said that with spending growth, you take off the any state aid, school choice, and there was a third category, I don't recall what it was. And then you take that number and that becomes the assessment to towns. But then when we got to a slide, it was 2 slides to the end, it showed the reserve funds, and one of those line items was school choice, and it had like $800,000 in it. So my question is, if we're taking it off top and not assessing it, how is it building? And that's just, I'm naive to that. I'm really asking the question to understand it.
Yeah.
Because that's a big number.
That's a great question.
$5,000 per student without what we're taking off the top.
We actually had a 20-minute discussion about how we explain that.
Okay.
So Avi, go.
All right. So the answer is that we get annual revenue from the sending communities for the kids that come here in that year. And how it happens is the Department of Ed takes Chapter 70 state aid money from that district and sends it to us and marks it as school choice. And the amount is $5,000 per pupil plus an increment for special education costs. Plus, if a student whose school choice goes out of district, 100% of that amount gets reimbursed, including the transportation. And that all happens 1 year in arrears. So our budgetary strategy for many, many years running has been to estimate what the annual revenue will be and to use that as an expense in that year so that the actual balance does not really change. And so we're using, what do we use that money for? We essentially deduct that exact amount of money from our budget and charge it to the school choice fund. That's how the Department of Education and Department of Revenue Regulations require you to do it, but essentially it's just an offset to our spending. So that's why you'll see on our budgetary slides, we've had an offset of about $325,000, and we tried to match the two. So in that sense, the goal is for the reserve fund balance to not change. Why is it changing on the slide there? Because we don't have enough in stabilization to fund $1.2 million of turf field replacements. And as of now, we're not planning to do a debt exclusion or a vote to the towns. We're planning to treat it like an asset of ours that people expect us to pay for because it has a useful life, and you knew when you bought it how long that would be. And we're trying to do the right thing. As you know, we have certainly stretched the duration of those fields quite a bit. And I think certainly with Highland, we can't wait any longer. Brook Street is in slightly better condition, but even that one was put in 2000, I believe in 2008. So we have an obligation to move right now the school choice reserve fund, not the annual revenue, but the savings is going to be dedicated there. Why do we have that savings at all? There was a time in this district, because we really kept the balance pretty stable over time, but there was a time in this district where we had many more school choice students. I think the annual revenue was something like $800,000 a year. That was in the time prior to the big 27% enrollment growth. We now know that enrollment's coming down. So as growth was happening in resident population from, I want to say fiscal 7 to fiscal 16, we let school choice kids graduate without replacing them bit by bit to work that number down to make space for resident students as that enrollment was growing. So we still have that reserve from that time, but we try not to touch it for the reasons that we've discussed. Does that answer your question?
It does answer it, kind of long. I only need one piece.
I'm sorry.
Let me simplify this, just to make sure I get it.
Yeah.
If you have 10 school choice kids at $5,000 apiece, you take off $50,000 off top of the budget, but the state may give you back 150 or 200,000, so that money goes into your reserve account above and beyond.
If we underestimate, it would go into reserve. Generally, what we see is there's a little bit of a year-to-year play because of the out-of-district kids.
Okay.
So there's a little bit of change because that we charge in the current year, if we have anyone go out of district or transportation needs, we charge it this year, we get that reimbursement next year.
Gotcha.
So that's a little bit of a variance.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sorry for the long answer.
I love it.
Please.
Ben Buttrick, Essex. I have a bunch of questions. So I don't want to hijack the meeting. So
Start with here.
I've got a
Throw
very big picture question to ask kind of initially. And that is, so the 3.5% plus $756,000, which we know is basically the right sizing. So that is eliminating revenue from reserves, which I totally get. It's reserves for operating. My question is, if that basically catches us up, what about the next 3 to 5 years? And should we be padding that number? Because from an Essex perspective, 750 kind of puts us right on the edge between, being able to use our reserves versus an override. And if we're going to do an override, it should be this spring, because we wouldn't want to have to be doing it too close to the EES vote in my mind. So then the question is, if we're going to go through a whole process of, educating residents for an override, it is the 700. How confident are you in that $756,000 number? And I know there's no absolutes, so it's really kind of a pulse. And maybe this is a real sort of topic of debate for all of you.
I don't mind taking it.
Go ahead.
Because I'm going to start.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to where
Yeah.
we started with. This is very preliminary. It's December. We don't have any real numbers. We have numbers based on conversation and past experience. So we believe it's a solid number. How confident that we don't have something happen between now and February that throws it in a different, moderately so, but we need to be cautious. And I think we need to model exactly the question you just asked. But that's why we're seeking some feedback from you tonight too, right? So we have a sense of how you're thinking about managing this number.
Can I just ask clarification? Were you asking how confident are we in the 750 for next year's budget or to carry us 3 to 5 years?
To carry us 3 to 5
This
years.
is just an
No.
announcement of the current gap. It's not a plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that was basically,
And-
thank you,
Yeah.
because that,
Uh-huh.
Jake, I appreciate that. The feedback from the Essex standpoint, if I know this is sort of give and take here, but I mean, it is 3.5%, the apportionment issue for Essex, as much as we say it's cyclical, it's really structural. If you look at the entrance of the breakdown of students in the elementary years, the ratio of Essex versus Manchester students is considerably higher than it's been historically. And even if there's a 3-year smoothing in that number, I'm just not confident in the next 3 to 5 years that it's going to cycle back. So we have to plan from an assumption that even a 3.5% budget is really 5% for Essex. And so I'm trying to think about, if we're going to do an override, why don't we fund the next 3 to 5 years? And maybe this is sort of a, specifically a town issue versus a district issue, but it's going to affect the ask. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of like, what is the right number? And it's a balance between being able to do what you need to do over the next 3 to 5 years versus, plugging the current gap, I guess. So, it's not giving you an absolute answer, but, that's what we're puzzling right now.
Thank you.
And my comment to that would be also that, because we also have discussed this as well, and really needing to look at some modeling of what that would look like, because we want to be aware that, again, as Annie alluded to, this is a both towns issue. It's unique to Essex in the increase in recent years, from the apportionment, but it is unique to both towns, especially coming out of the report that we're on borrowed time with some of the really big expenses at Essex Elementary. And so if we are going, everybody, I think we all had hoped to get, closer to the roll off, but what it's looking like is we really are gambling with that. And so my hope is that at our collaborative meeting Monday, we can start to tackle a lot of this as well, and continue that conversation, because it's the same concern we all have. Yeah.
Can I add that, the only way to solve this, in my mind, but I don't know if we have the time this year, is to do at least 3-year plan for all 3 units and then line them up. And then, so all 3, both towns and the district, we can see what the next 3 years looks like and how it impacts the 3. Without that, I think we are doing a lot of conceptual discussions and whatnot. So I don't know if we're gonna get there by, in 2 months or so before we go into the vote, which is something to think about.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's, a lot of it is just how you model out the apportionment for Essex, which actually leads to my next question. And that is, the withdrawals that we're seeing of students, between 8th and 9th grade. It would be helpful if we could get, and relying on DESI data, go back a decade, it was like 4.5%. Now it's up around 19% if you average over the last 2 years. And so what I'm wondering is, do you have the breakdown of students, Essex versus Manchester students, in that withdrawal? Because it's hard to model it if you don't have all the data exactly of the enrollment. So, and I get nervous relying on DESI data for doing that. So that would be helpful.
This is well-covered territory. I'm sure Pam can speak to it, but I know that they're actually studying this right now in great detail.
And I know mine is purely a data question, because I know there's a second order question, which is, well, why do we, and I know there's work being done. That's not something you can easily, that's a process that has to be put in place. But,
Don't we have those numbers, or are
We
we
have
not
them.
allowed to?
Are you?
It's roughly 15 students that we have identified that qualified. 15 students that departed for private school between 8th and 9th grade, with another 8 that went to Essex Tech.
So I think the question was what percentage is.
of the 15.
I don't
what is-
have Essex, we don't,
Yeah.
we count, they're all our kids. So
Right.
we can go back and kind of parse out who went where.
right? Because that does, it would be helpful to know that from the portion.
But what's really moving the needle is what you alluded to earlier, which is when we were doing this presentation, I'm looking at the familiar faces in the audience back, when we were pursuing an override in the 14-15 time period. We were talking about a 27% spike in enrollment. So you can kind of see where that hit the two towns then. At that point, Memorial School had escalated to 435 students, I believe, at its height. And that's where the students have declined. So as those students have moved through the system and graduated, Memorial is now 280 students, which is closer in size to where Essex lives. And I believe Essex is around 230, 235. So Essex has had a smaller decline from the boom, right? During the boom, they went up a full class. That was rolled off. But it's really the demographic exit. I don't think the 15 students, I think the 15 students between 8th and 9th grade is a study of why are people opting out? There's post-COVID, there's program, there's a study to be done and a study that's being undertaken by the high school to understand better why people are making the choices. But it's not I don't believe it is the 15 students that are moving the needle. I believe it's the 200 plus students that are causing the shift. And at one point, the shift did favor Essex, where they were substantially below assessment, where Manchester was up in the near 4% range. So it is cyclical. It has moved over time, and as numbers stabilize, it should draw closer together. That's Pam math, not Avi approved.
But
So
if you look at the elementary school, like the ratio between the two elementary schools, it's more like 45% Essex, 55 to Manchester, whereas the bigger ratio has been historically like 35-65. So what I'm thinking is 10 years from now, when those cycle through, we could be looking at 45, 45-55, which would certainly not suggest that the apportionment's going to reverse.
But I think if you go back closer to, and we don't have to debate this fully tonight, closer to like the 8, 9, 10 years, I think Essex piece of the apportionment was closer to the 50s. So we have that. We can go back and look at it.
The other thing I would just say is, well, it's true that we have looked at the most recent years of elementary and seen that trend. I don't know how much you can create a multi-year analysis off of this, but the kindergarten numbers were closer to the traditional split. It's really the first, second, third grade where we saw that, I would say, pretty substantial change in percentage mix. So even 3 years with the 3-year smoothing factor in the model could take 3 to 6 years to roll through apportionment, to your point. Does that mean it's going to be a 10-year trajectory? I think it's a little too early to say that, because it could just be a 3-year bubble that corrects once the kindergarten, if the kindergarten portends to what's coming. So I don't think we really have a good sense for the multi-year, but I do think we have a good sense for the near term. And if you're looking 1 to 3 years out, I think we have something we could model, and that, as everyone's been saying, that is a topic of conversation for sure.
That would be helpful. One other question, the FTEs, the 4 FTEs, can you talk a little bit about, as it says in the memo, through attrition, and wondering, are those planned retirements? Are they positions that are currently open that you're just not going to fill?
We anticipate planned retirements.
Okay, anticipated retirements. And are those on the special or the general side?
Split. We're not ready to start putting people and names and programs.
No, I know,
Yeah.
I'm not asking.
So we believe
Let's keep it a little more general,
we
Mr.
believe
Webster.
we have a reduction of 4 to be made that has no impact on program.
Thank you. Anyone else in person? Jeff, please.
Jeff Sular, Essex. I actually want to circle back to something Andy brought up about the Brook Street fields and paying for that with capital exclusions in the town versus using your reserve funds. The mechanics of it, it's a lot more appealing, at least I can't speak for Manchester, but in the town of Essex, it's a lot more appealing to do those as capital exclusions, one-time capital exclusions in Essex. We could then utilize free cash that we have available which we tend to reserve for one-time expenses. And then in theory, if you're willing to be spending $1.2 million of your reserves, you utilizing those same funds against operations is a lot more palatable to us, because then we are using one-time free cash money to offset, ongoing operating expenses. And it might be enough that it's enough that we, with some other machinations, we might be able to avoid an override. And I was thinking of, when Andy brought it up, but also I was thinking about it because Pam mentioned a feasibility study, and that would be using your resource. And the same principle would apply. And I believe we've done this in the past, where we've gone to the towns and asked the towns to vote to pay for a feasibility study. And if we did that, the same concept would apply. We would use free cash one time, pay for that, and it would be over and done with, but we wouldn't be, what we're looking at doing now is potentially creating an ongoing operational override, which is tougher to pass. So I think there's some validity to looking into that. And the only, obviously the downside would be if you said we can't, wait until May to have a capital exclusion override vote, to handle these fields. But certainly from the feasibility study, that I think it's worth looking into going forward, at least, speaking from the Essex side of things.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, John Round, Manchester. What's the projected head count that you've got for the district based upon, but for this particular budget? And is there any kind of an assumption? I know that Manchester has been dropping relative to Essex in the apportionment. Do you have a head count for each of those that you've assumed, or where are you at?
Are you talking about students or staff? So for the current budget, we are assuming, really, we don't model a change in enrollment other than to look at FTE based on where we're at to see, because I think what we have seen over the years is that projecting enrollment is a pretty dicey matter. And that's one of the reasons why the MSBA, for example, took away projections from districts when they were doing them for building projects, because there are a couple of firms that do it. They're notoriously unreliable. So we don't really do that, but we do have enough multi-year data to say, do we feel like based on where we're at now, can we reduce? So that's really how the numbers are coming. If Pam has additional information on how we get to the 4 FTE, please chime in. But the 4 FTE reduction is based on what we're seeing now and what we see we can adjust for next year, if that answers your question.
What was the head count?
The trends, I assume, are still down. I know that you haven't got a number, but you're not
No,
assuming that
we-
necessarily.
Yeah, so
We have an October one.
yeah, the number for the current year is
20?
12, well, actually, give me 1 second, I apologize, because that's the number, for all the schools, 1220. When we, factor in total enrollment, we also look at kids who are part of our district, who are out of district. Yeah, I can plug in to throw it up. Including the out of district students, we're at 1244.
Can you send it to me?
I did.
Okay.
So we can show how that looks on a multi-year basis.
Can I?
Yep.
Gives, Manchester, so Pam, can you just maybe expand upon that? So if you don't have an enrollment
the other one?
projection, how do you come up with the 4 FTE? How do you have confidence you can eliminate 4 positions if you don't know what enrollment's in?
We will.
I'm the least informed of this group, I think, here, so I think I represent the community too, right? Just
I can't
trying to ask the proactive.
Ask a question. So what we'll do is, how we do it, we talk to the principals, they take stock of what they have now, they see where their highs and lows are. And then we'll look at retirement, and we may be shifting people into other positions. We may be reorganizing how a program is run. We may be able to take, if we have a specialty program that typically has 16 kids and we're down to 8, we could reduce a head there. But we're going to take the head reductions by people who we believe are moving on, and then reorganize staff to provide same level of service.
It's just interesting, I'm here.
So I could cut you could likely cut a classroom, because right now, if you can project your enrollment at the elementary schools and what sizes the classes may be next year, on the numbers today, we think we can reduce a class.
The level services
Yep.
term seems very broad, right? So as somebody that's trying to understand that, you know, I came to town 4 years ago, and the feedback that you hear in community is that we've been cutting. So I thought you brought up great points about 3 to 5 years. And can we maintain so I'm gonna use a different term, right? The quality of the education, the 19% number. So I have a 7th grader, right? That's kind of going into 8th, and they're in that phase where they're assessing whether or not they're gonna go private. And I can tell you that there's a lot of conversations about a lot of kids going private. That's very interesting. And I think this conversation now that we're having, this has been addressed, and I don't need to take a lot of time, but the 19% is something I think that needs to be correlated to level services, the cuts over the past bunch of years, and whether or not that's sustainable long term. But there's been great discussion about this and some great points. And I think that really needs to be looked at closely to understand what level services really means, because I'm not so sure that the community, specifically parents, are looking for level services, right? So again, I'm new to this process, so I don't know how it gets kicked around relative to, are we really going for level services as a community? I understand, I attend town meetings, I understand finance committees, I understand. But there is an opportunity here, right? You stop short of talking about an override, right? So I'll just throw that out there for everybody listening, like that is likely what's coming. So I've been through many overrides in many different towns, and that is an opportunity to educate the community on all these things and to get feedback from the community about what their expectations for the district are. And I'm not so sure level services as they exist today is the expectation of the community. I don't know, I'm one person speaking for myself, but I do know from my peer group that 19% can be studied all you want, but it's based upon concern about the level of services that we're providing in high school. So said a lot there, but I think, you know, it really needs to be looked at. And I thought you brought up a great point about, you know, just maintaining over the next 3 to 5 years, this budget trend of excess of 2.5%. But we also need to think about what additional services do we need to maintain ourselves as the top 10 district in the state. You know, I'm not so sure on that trend.
No, and I'll comment to that, you know, in the past couple of years, a lot of the conversation has been about money. And, you know, we do have a new strategic plan. We've got, you know, outlook for excellence. We absolutely do. And a lot of that strategic plan can be done without gigantic financial investment because of the economic situation that we're in. You know, we have 2 member towns with, you know, with similar, but, you know, unique needs and outlooks and everything. But I think you're right that it is definitely time for that conversation. I just want to be very clear with everyone listening to that the enrollment, that conversation that does happen, you know, about the 8th to 9th shift is well covered territory here. We discussed it, well, we've discussed it many times, but also in the spring and then again in the fall, and then sent Pam off with a charge to look more in depth. She's utilizing, you know, the high school, and they're looking at that more in depth. We'll get a report out on that at some point, but we want to give it time to get it done right, rather than just have it be an informal thing like that. So thank you.
And also, I'm Kate. I will add that we take community input seriously, and we hear what you're saying, and we actually don't get that much community input. We sit here in this room mostly by ourselves with maybe 2 faces popping up on the screen every now and then, but
Anne's always
like,
here.
thank you for coming and providing us with some direction and some input, because we do take it seriously and we are listening. And if anybody else is out there listening, please join us.
Just one final comment to that point. I mean, anybody that's attended the town meeting and saw what happened, really unfortunate situation with the zoning bylaw changes and the work that board did. I mean, I felt terrible for everybody that did the work, but the community, generally speaking, you know, doesn't make the time, and I'm guilty myself, or carve out the time to be informed. So I just encourage the board to use that as an example of what's not even possible, but probable that you're going to face when you go to position an override, and to really think about how can you do things different to educate the community. And that's one of the reasons I'm here, because I think it's my responsibility. Some friends of mine that are on the board, that I made a commitment that I would help, you know, educate the community on these things. But I think there needs to be a conscious effort the outreach into the community, specifically if you're talking about, not just funding, this gap, but right, increasing services. It's not, we all know who shows up at town meeting. It's not the people that want the change, it's the people that don't want the change. So, you have me as a sponsor for that, but I think there needs to be some real thought about how it's presented at town meeting, how these sessions are run. Because if you just say you should have, I should have educated myself on the zoning bylaws. I just don't have time. I have a million things going on. And if it was pitched differently at town meeting with an overview, it was, I'm not afraid to say it was terribly done. You can't do that. And so I would encourage the board, and there's some very smart folks on the board who are experienced with pitching boards and pitching.
Thank you.
Works, I think.
Thank you. Were you saying something?
I just wanted, is everyone, I think there's stages, so I think the questions being posed. The charge is to prepare a level services budget. The level services budget is already in deficit of $756,000. So we presented the set of questions tonight about what isn't included and what should be included to get toward that aspirational piece. If that's the direction that collectively all of the boards can support, right? Because in order to get to an override point, we need the cooperation and endorsement of the folks in this room, or the board could choose to go it alone. So that's a board decision that we're going to have to make
Right.
over the next few weeks. So I think what we're trying to do is take the temperature as to what direction you would like to go in, and then we can build it forward.
Thank you.
But just to clarify, the enrollment reduction cuts are projected reductions we can make without making any changes to the current programs offered.
I'm going to go to the back. I saw Caroline's hand. Are you ready, or
Maybe I shouldn't say anything. I get a
do you want to wait until you have it together? Go ahead.
I live from Manchester, and Matt, I just want to push back a little bit on what you're saying, and when I was on the school committee, I said everything that you were saying, but the community has to show up. I mean, these are elected officials that can only do so much, but the community, I take that as like, now I'm not in the school committee anymore, I hope that I can get the community and get them to start speaking and advocate, because I believe that they will support it. They don't want level services, they want the level of education that we all anticipate, but it can't just be the school committee. Like, you have to start getting friends to come, show up, and talk to the board of selectmen, the FinCom, and say, this is what we want. So I just want to push back, and I support Pam on what you said about the kids leaving from 8th and 9th grade. The trajectory that you mentioned is exactly how I remember it over the past 10 years. So
It's up this year, but it's not, it's
Yeah.
about 10% up this year. Which would be about,
10% is what?
yeah, it's 15 kids.
Yeah.
And the last time 15 kids exited for private school was probably 7 years ago.
But that's the bubble, and that's the level services, so people want, so yes. But the community
There's
has to-
always program quality improvements to be made, and I guess what I'm always very careful to do, and this may be a problem. Level services doesn't mean reduction in quality, or that we don't pursue quality. And I think if the question is quality of service at the middle high school, that's one thing. Level services is and maybe we need a new phrase, but it's a phrase designed to say, we are not looking for $1 million investment in a gym. We're not looking for $1 million investment, I'm using inflated numbers, to add, 7 new AP programs. We can work within the financial construct that we have to either improve programming, change programming to modernize it. If we have 8 APs, we're not going down to 4 APs, but we can probably offer those 8 APs with 2 less staff because we have 40 less kids. So it's being able to give the same breadth, so I think I would love to learn more going forward. Are we talking about quality and experience, or are we talking about expansion of services, meaning more different, like 6 new athletic teams and, 4 new STEM courses that would require a whole additional set of staff to deliver. So that's how I make the distinction in my mind. I'm very open to anybody who can help us define it a little bit better.
Well, I think it's a really important distinction because quality wise, I feel very, very confident in the educators that we have in our school system. I think that we have, for the most part, amazing teachers and that we're very lucky with the quality of instruction that our kids get. If we're talking about quantity, if we're talking about breadth of programming, if we're talking about, you know, state of the art, hands-on tech labs and that sort of thing, that would be a cost. There would be a specific cost associated with that, right? It's not so much, it's not our teacher salary, it's not our teacher training, it's something that we have to purchase. And so I think it's an important distinction, and I think that it's one that bears repeating so that people know exactly what we're talking about.
As well as, oh, I'm sorry, I can't, we have to, we're doing one person at a time to get through everyone. Sorry. Thank you. I have to do it. It's my job. It's literally my job. Okay. Caroline, are you through?
Yes, that's not fair, but like I think we do have quality education here. I was saying that I've always wanted more. So I'm not bitching to our teachers, anybody. We have not been able to build or do more in probably like either. And if the community wants that, that was my point. They need to come, but we have great. What we have now is great. I just think there's more.
Thank you. Nina.
Nina McKinnon, Essex. I was curious, Abby, if you know, because I have children, I've spent 5 or 6 years back with these meetings. And at this time, you always say you don't recommend using reserves for operational costs. You're very good at, from a financial standpoint. When did we start using reserves? Was it in the last 3 years or 5 years? And do you know that has been averaging 200,000 to 300,000 a year? Like I know last year was a bigger number, but I'm just curious if we don't need it right now or just.
No, it's
I get
quick.
the actual numbers, but my recollection is 2020 at the request of Essex post-budget because there was a financial issue. So the committee discussed it and wanted to be supportive of the situation because we all find ourselves there and put $100,000 in that year with the extended discussion about once we start the process, it will escalate every year. And I believe it steadily grew to 330 for the next 2 years, and it was 520 last year. Is that right?
Yep.
So 4 years.
Etched in my brain. So in 4 years, it went from 100 to 520.
So it started about 3 to 4 years ago.
FY20.
FY20 to be using and just not stopping in the sense of.
Well, because once it goes in.
Yeah.
To take it out will escalate the assessment bill to the towns.
And then my other would be based on the conversation in some ways we just had, but without having to go into a circle again. I'm not saying I'm pro against anything for override, but I think for educating the community, like I tell people get on, Kate has seen me on Facebook, don't complain if you're not here. There's an optic that we are 220 to 230 students less with the same staffing. So to go back to leveled services makes it kind of confusing. I know we've had other FinCom members in previous years say, in some ways, you'd almost think we'd be doing even more if we had the same staffing with that many less students. I'm just saying so how it plays itself out. I know you've shown some slides that staffing has shown to be more on the sort of special ed as opposed to gen ed. So is that kind of playing into where is the gen ed population maybe having concerns as to what they want to look at? You know, I'm throwing out a lot of different things, but at the height of our population of students, part of it was because we had so many school choice kids. I think we had the 1,500 plus students. If we're now at 1,221, but we're at the same staff, that does need to get explained, you know, in the broader sense. Someone, I know.
That has been.
I'm not saying.
That's been covered in a number of meetings. I feel like maybe part of this conversation moving forward as well, that, you know, however this shakes out for this budget season, we can always be referring people back to those specific presentations because they've been given for sure.
But to clarify, level services does not mean.
Oh, no, I know that. And that's the same thing. We all know that, but I think there's.
To everyone out there.
Yeah, I think there's that general sense though, if we have 225, let's just say less students, but we have the exact same number of teachers. You think we'd actually be doing more? You know, we'd offer it more or something, however you play that, some people would be able to, some just serving that.
I get it.
Thank you. I think that only leaves Mike in person. Did you, would you like to say anything?
Well, I think about this,
Name.
Oh, sorry, name and town, please, for the record. I know.
I think it gets to the lumpiness issue. How you have to sort of deal with this. And what is the ask this year? How do you develop?
Can you speak up a little bit, Mike?
What's that?
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, how do you propel it? So the ask this year is 3.5% in the assembly. Now, how do you manage that relative to the overall asks in the upcoming? And the lumpiness is the issue, if this was a business, we'd have a 5-year set of projections and they wouldn't be right, but we have a set of assumptions and we live by it. We don't project forward enrollment and, there's some other issues, but that managing that system, and I think Jeff's idea was a great idea about balancing a short-term capital need versus a long-term capital. How do you manage that over the long term? So I guess my question would be, what does the capital look like? What are the capital needs, after, this 750,000? And that's one of the key questions I have in mind. Is there any way to get a better handle?
Yeah, so we did have a presentation in November about the state of Essex Elementary, which is our major capital need. It was also the first time that we took a look at the middle school, high school, which is in very good condition, but what we know is that it's already 10 years in, and let's just say that Essex Elementary becomes a capital project in the next several years. By the time that capital project is done, you're going to be at the mid-year life of this, based on the fact that MSBA requires buildings are built to a 50-year standard. So you're certainly going to be halfway through. What happens halfway through? Well, at that point, you start talking about roof replacement costs. You start looking at mechanical systems that just need to be replaced midway through. So those are some of the things that were addressed in the Habib presentation. Habib and Associates Architects, they're the design firm doing the facility condition assessment in November. So there are going to be quite a number of those costs. How does that impact our capital planning process? Well, first, I just want to say on the multi-year planning process for the operating, we do continue to use a multi-year budgeting process to show a couple of things. What a steady growth rate in spending, which we tend to have, does for assessments over time when non-town revenues are growing at a low rate. And so that's where we show the need for either additional funds from reserves and how those would grow if we don't make a change. That's what we showed in the multi-year operating budget last year, in the past couple of years. Those are in the town brochures that we send to all the community members to show what would happen to reserves if we continued to plow them in and didn't pull them out. We also talk about the fact that if we do pull them out, that at some point the assessments need to catch up, which is why we're here. So we're going to continue to use that multi-year operating budgeting process to look at what happens over time. And I think the people who are here are talking about the 3 to 5 year number and whether 756 for a multi-year is a different number. That's exactly where our multi-year model, which we've been using for probably 8 or 9 years now, comes into play and lets everyone kind of run their own scenarios of what does this look like, not just for the next year, but for a couple of years out. In terms of the capital cost, sorry, the last thing I just want to say is, yeah, so on the capital side, I would just say that most of the types of things that we're seeing in the Habib and Associate report, most of them are of a significant level. They're not going to fit within your annual operating budget, and they're going to need a sizable investment. And really, with the type of reserve numbers we're talking about, you might hit a small one of them. Those really need to be projects, building projects. So that's why we're talking about Essex going through that process. I think no one is really surprised about that. And for the middle school, high school, the costs that you're talking about there are certainly bigger at the 25-year mark than what we have in reserves. So that would also need to be some type of a more structural capital needs, even if it's not for a full building replacement, just for a roof. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, but I was getting more towards the short versus the medium term, right? The big, hearing the turf fields are sort of a big number that's on the horizon. The biggest that what's the perspective on that medium term, relative to our use of override versus not, if there is a way to cobble something together here from our side of the town to get through this 750, what do the next 2, 3, 4 years look like? Before we get to these big capital expenditures, we understand Essex Elementary, has some big bills. We understand that in 10 years we'll be at a midpoint. What are those? Are there other turf fields? Maybe I'll be the simple ways. Are there other turf fields out there that we should be aware of that can help us manage through how we present and manage this? Because obviously our goal here is to provide the best education to our children. This is one of the best social programs that there is. And it's been providing excellent services. Our goals are the same, but I guess managing that message to the taxpayers, the voting population, that's the, for me, that medium-term question is crucial. Are there other turf fields out there in the medium? Are there other maybe 1.2, 1.3, aside from, roof issues? Do we see anything like that in the medium?
Only if we don't have a sufficient game plan for the EES building project. So that the EES not on a defined path is the next turf field.
Right?
And it could spring up at any point in time.
Because if you're talking to, the voting base in Essex, okay, the application of there's a need for turf field replacement. And then we have this whole project. That's very different than if there's 6 turf fields every 2 years or something like that magnitude. And I personally think it's different. You put a different wrapping around it when you present it for messaging.
The short answer is the needs are systemic. They're not individual needs really for Essex, and they are items that are best addressed through a multi-year capital change in terms of a project of some kind.
But I'd say it this way.
Can we put up the capital
We would
plan?
be having a different discussion if the turf field had double the lifespan that it has currently. The turf field is really bringing some of these issues to a point this year.
So I think I would state that the turf field has been in the planning process for over 5 years. And our initial intent was to handle it before COVID, and we were able to extend its life because we weren't using it as much during COVID. What has really disrupted our flow and disrupted our our modeling, our thoughtful planning, and our projections has been having to divert reserves into the operating and go through extended discussions each year on just managing a level services budget. I am very open to wanting to expand our program. I'm very open to investments. We could generate a list a mile long, and I am very respectful and I understand people's frustration that we don't seem to be talking in those terms. But you need to understand that we come before this group every year just trying to keep the lights on. Okay, and I think that gets lost in a lot of good intention, because yes, we should be talking about expansion of the arts and bringing on a theater teacher.
Yeah.
But I can't guarantee you that I'm not going to be sitting here in March trying to figure out what 12 people need to be let go if we have a failed override. So it's great to talk about an override, but it's a gamble, because I'm hearing very mixed things here tonight. I'm going to be very honest. I'm hearing, how can we make it work without an override? How can you continue to use reserves to manage the budget? But I'm also being asked, can't you be more aspirational? Can't you grow this thing? So I think we've been very explicit with all of our partners on what our needs are. And you keep asking us questions, but I think the questions really rest with you and with the 2 towns reconciling what they want from their schools and how they're going to come to terms with the mechanism that's in place to pay for it. Because we do pride ourselves on bringing it in at 3.5 and being consistent so you can plan. But even our good planning it isn't perfect, and it has swings that we've been showing here tonight that impact the towns differently. And it's those swings that call into question the budget every year. It's not our spending proposal. It's not our program proposal. There is quality work to be done, but we have no reliance that we're going to be able to do our basics from year to year, which drains time and energy from your key players in the district and doesn't allow them to invest the time and energy on solving other problems. It's a concern. It's a multi-year concern. I love this district. We've been doing this for 13 years, and the conversation is the same conversation every single year. That's why we've highlighted in our strategic plan that one of our key goals in the next 10 years is financial stability for this district and the next generations that are going to lead it. it's a question for the towns at this point.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Can I just piggyback on that and say, Jeff, we hear you on the not wanting to use reserves to fund an operating budget for the town. We're trying to avoid the same thing, and we've been doing it over and over, and as everyone has pointed out, it's not sustainable. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so asking us to dip back into our reserves at this point is not a feasible long-term solution.
To be fair, I was asked to dip into your reserves.
Right.
I was asking you to rejigger how you're using.
Well, right, but you were saying that if you could use the capital funds for the one-time expenses and we could use the reserves for the operation.
Some of your reserves for the operation.
Right.
So I'm gonna call a little rabbit hole on this because we're kind of going back out of order, and I did promise that we would do this in an orderly fashion. So,
got it.
So if you want to comment on Pam's comment or on Mike's, you are certainly welcome to. But
Well, I think it builds.
Yeah. Okay. I will piggyback on Pam's comment to say, I am not known for my optimism, but I will say, this is my third year on the committee, and the first two were fraught with a lot of tension. It was an unusual time and a really difficult time for everyone in every single way. And there is a change. And I think we are uniquely situated right now to actually put some attention and energy to solving collaboratively some of these problems, rather than just fighting the fight of the keeping the lights on. So I want to put that out there for anybody listening here. A lot of work has been done and is continuing to be done. So we need to capitalize on the fact that we do have a chance right now to actually work to solve some of these problems, now that some of the high temperature is lowering a little bit, if we can make that happen. Okay, Jake, and then I actually have to go to the people online before I take a second round in person.
I am hearing, and I certainly came into this role with the perception that a conversation is needed around what we mean by excellent schools.
Yep.
There's a lot of assumptions, I think, held and being made, but we have yet not articulated that ourselves or engaged the community in what they're specifically looking for. We have a strategic plan which starts us down that road, but we need to do a lot more to engage them on that and what that actually implies for program then. So I think the suggestion about what it means to have an excellent school has a lot of historical roots, and we have a long tradition of having certain things. And times change, and we need to reevaluate whether or not those program things are indeed what is getting us excellence.
Am I
Thank you.
misunderstanding that the strategic plan was led by community input?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so turning to our online people who have been so patiently waiting, in the chat, currently we have 3. Just as a reminder, if you have not already put your name in the chat and you wish to make a comment, if it's just a comment or observation or feedback, please limit to 2 to 3 minutes. If you have questions to engage, then we will honor that. First, I have Karen Gertsch, 11 Haskell Court. Can you unmute yourself if you're still with us?
Yes, hi, I'm still here. You have answered my question already. Can you
Hold on 1 second, Karen. We want to make sure we can hear you through the owl. Hold on 1 moment, please.
Yeah. Yes.
So that was on my computer.
Right.
Can you turn up my?
Can you hear me now?
Use this one right there.
If we do this.
Just stand over to one side. Stay over to one side. Have you got me on there? No.
Should be.
Karen, can you try again?
Sure, I've got myself unmuted here.
Can you just open up so we can at least get the question?
Yeah.
They can hear us, but we can't hear them.
Hey, can you hear me? No.
Oh, sort of.
Okay.
Can
Can you hear me now? No. Shoot. What is this right here?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I should be unmuted. Can you hear me? Gosh.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. you had partly answered my question, someone did during the presentation. But I was just wondering if somebody has a number, if we know how much it costs per student to educate a Manchester or Essex student, and we are getting students coming in from outside the district, do we know that in the end, with however the money comes to us, that it equals the same amount that it costs us as taxpayers in our two towns? Does anybody know the answer to that question?
Thank you. Go ahead,
We
Pam.
do. Do you want to take it?
Sure. So with the school choice program, the amount of money that you get, I was talking about this earlier, is close to the level. It's about 5,000 per pupil plus an increment that you can get on top of that for special education costs. Whereas the average cost per pupil is much higher than that, at around $19,000 in the most recent year that we put online. And so that immediately raises the question of why would you ever do that? And the answer is, if you have extra space in a classroom and you can add school choice students in without adding additional cost, then it's money that provides extra revenue without additional cost. That's the concept of marginal revenue without marginal cost. I know that's a technical term. So, however, if you are in full classrooms and taking school choice kids would require you to add staff, at that point, it really doesn't make sense because you're adding costs that are not likely to be brought back. So every year, the school committee goes through the process together with Pam to look at the grade by grade level classrooms to see where are there places to take new school choice kids such that we don't believe it would kind of introduce new costs. And so that's why it does become a net benefit to the district financially based on our analysis.
Can I follow up with that? Because this is something that has come up in the past as well, recently on social media. Does that mean also then that, for instance, if new development happened, every student that comes in does not necessarily mean the increase of the bill is 19,000 and change, right?
That's right. That's the
So can
average
you just
cost.
elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Because there was some misinformation going around recently.
That's right. So the average cost is based on all of the costs divided by all the pupils. And it actually factors in all funds, not just the budget, but other funds that we spend on pupils from grant programs, which are fully reimbursed by the grant program, even though there's no, and with no cost to the taxpayer. So that's not necessarily the cost to the taxpayer. That's the cost that the amount that we spend, including funds from other sources. For example, athletics and fees that we get. In answer to your question, and actually, I already.
That's right. You got it.
Yeah. So, well, sorry, did I miss any part of it?
So that, for instance, if there were new development in of, 8 to 10 houses or something, and families moved in, that doesn't necessarily mean that however many children times 19,000 and change is the direct.
So the incremental cost for new students as they come in might be a couple more teachers if you needed that, but it wouldn't be at the same average cost because the average cost includes all the maintenance, all of the health insurance, et cetera. So yeah, the new cost would be probably less than that.
She opened the door, so I wanted to clarify because there was some misinformation recently. Karen, do you have more questions?
Yes, my question is, can you hear me okay? Because my question is, why can't we get the same amount of money per student from students who are coming from outside our two communities so that everyone is paying their fair share? I guess that's my question, and I'm not hearing that happens. So you've answered my question.
I'm in complete agreement with you, and it's regulated by the state, but we continue to lobby them to modernize their formula so that there is more revenue coming to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, Karen?
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hanging in and waiting for us.
Okay.
Next in the chat, we have Guy Bradford from Essex.
Selectman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lobby.
This is Guy Bradford. I'm a selectman. So I have a couple of questions. First, about the reserves. So it appears that when you had the the screen up on the reserves, about 2/3 of the reserves come from excess and deficiencies, correct?
Yes.
So that, if I understand correctly, that means that's underspending against the budget, right? Correct?
Correct.
On a multi-year basis. The number is pretty stable from a year to year, so that's prior year savings, correct?
Right, right. So I guess my question is, when we say we don't want to continue to utilize reserves, uh, those reserves are basically monies that came into the the school from the towns, correct?
Yes. And actually, the Department of Revenue.
So I guess my question is, why would we say we don't? So when we have free cash in Essex at the end of the year, and we total up we come to a total, we decide we may want to invest some of those that free cash into projects or things that we need to do for the town. Why do we say now that we don't want, the school doesn't want to let that excess inflow from the towns be spent back and to reduce their future input?
Guy, I would argue that we do want to return it to the towns, but we're returning it in a way that's dedicated to capital funds and plans, capital investments and planned spending. Because we don't, at this time, we don't charge or have a dedicated line item annually asking for contribution to a stabilization account for that. So what we try to do is manage our budget tightly, and any surplus we have goes into the rainy day fund for upcoming projects, like the turf field. Otherwise, we would both be charging operating costs and doing small debt exclusions for every project that came up.
Yeah.
So it is a return
So
to the
basically,
town,
what
just in a
you're
different
saying,
form.
yeah. So what you're saying basically is what we are contributing on the assumption that it's operating. If there's excess left over, you're diverting it into a capital fund, right?
Yes. Yep.
Oh,
Wow.
haven't taken,
Okay.
I would just clarify that a little bit. We haven't diverted any excess and deficiency into the capital fund. So that's not exactly the way that's played out. All the money in the stabilization fund that's been in there, which is close to $1 million, came in from interest income on the bonds from the Memorial School project that we've diverted to primarily Essex Elementary to keep that program at the elementary level in line. The funds that are in any of our reserve funds, including excess and deficiency, are not recurring. There's no recurring source of revenue. So it's not going to grow. It's just a number that's essentially flat until we start spending it. So therefore, it becomes one-time funds. The operating budget, by contrast, is recurring spending every year. So if we were to use one-time money to pay for our recurring spending, then at some point you would use it all up and you would still have that operating need. So you would be forced to start cutting spending. So really what we're trying to say is absolutely that's money, that's taxpayer money that we want to use to minimize taxpayer costs. We just want to use it to minimize taxpayer costs on non-recurring projects like the turf fields would be an example, or projects that we've been doing at Essex Elementary, or having money ready to go. So if we don't get our lottery card from MSBA picked on Essex Elementary and we need to replace a boiler, but as Pam said, that happened while we were waiting for a building project to occur. Those are one-time projects that are not going to be every year, year after year. So we're really talking about using taxpayer money in a prudent way that doesn't set up a funding cliff where suddenly 3 or 4 years from now, we're going back to taxpayers and say, hey, we spent the savings account and now we've got a huge number that we need you to pick up. We're just trying to manage how that taxpayer money gets used to offset taxpayer expense. So absolutely, we agree with your basic assumption. It's just about doing it in a way that's strategic and sustainable.
Just
Yep.
very quickly, because we're kind of getting in the weeds and talking technical. Avi and I are actually saying the same thing, but he is making the distinction that the only fund which is by statute dedicated to capital is stabilization. In our definition of funds, we see all of these in combination dedicated to capital improvements and one-time costs. So E&D isn't definitionally restricted to that, which is why you can put it in your operating budget if you wanted to. So sometimes when we get going on all of our slight different interpretations of things, I'm sure it gets confusing for people.
Yep, sorry
But
about that.
we use all of these in total to take care of one-time investments.
And this is something I will add to that and say this is something our committee has talked about taking on a reserve use policy over the course of this year. Hopefully being able to, if we have the bandwidth to take that on, coming up with a reserve use policy. And also keeping in mind, I know I've had to vote what to do beyond a certain level of excess and deficiency at the end of the year. And recognizing that in the last few years, we've started off by putting in, this year it was 520, the year before it was 335. And so when we had to vote about what to do with the 220 or whatever it was left over, we chose to put that back in as the replenishment. So we do have the opportunity at the committee level. So part of these conversations is us hearing, what the temperature is and what people's interests are. So thank you for sharing that. Did you have any other questions, Guy?
Yes. Or not a question, more of a suggestion. With respect to one of the issues with staffing, I understand is the special advanced programs. And has there been any consideration to trying to consolidate special programs across school districts or with local colleges, so that we don't have to run a French 4 with 5 kids if Hamilton has 5 or so forth and so on?
We're always looking for those opportunities, Guy.
And we might mention right now that the school council at the high school is undertaking a review of the AP that's been reported out here.
The blessing and the curse of being a small school is we're small, we have small class sizes, but there are specialty programs that will only get a certain level of subscription. So we will never phase that out on a student as they're entering the 11th or 12th grade. We will carry the program even if it is for 4 because they've counted on having it. What the high school principal will start to look at now is if we are going to have to cut our way out of the $756,000 deficit, then what is the rotating schedule on which these programs will be offered? That would be a cut in service, right? You can only get your AP.
I'm
Guy,
sorry.
1 second. Guy, just one moment. Let Pam finish her thought and then you can reply.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Basically, that would be kind of a cut in service, right? Because we'd be limiting access. You can only take X class in odd years or even years. We wouldn't want to go there. That may be something that we have to do. So I don't think in a district of this size with the need for singletons, we're always going to rule out all classes that are on the lower side of 8. Our operational number is 12, that we shouldn't be running and planning classes in the early scheduling period that have less than 12, but you may have 12 to start and 4 drop out because it's in conflict with something else they want to take. So Trish is a master at this. We have singletons that bump up against one another. So a classic is, Caroline's gone now, you want French 4 and you want chorus and they go at the same time, and sometimes you have to pick. So we can have shifts in enrollment that follow us right through the beginning of the year. So to the point of the quality of program, we don't want to be in a district that is limiting access for kids so tightly that we can't absorb the one-off outlier every once in a while that has kids below subscription, right? That would be something that's not how we operate or have not had to operate in the past. So those are some of the nips and tucks that we'll be getting into in this next generation of program reduction. It will be very limiting. I think we'll still offer quality with what we have, but it won't have the flexibility. we are always talking with our partners in other districts about how do you combine courses? How can you leverage tech to maybe have the combined course with Hamilton in here? You know, there are just sometimes very unexciting, but very practical reasons it doesn't work. We're on a rotating waterfall schedule. It doesn't align with theirs. Then you need to ask the kid to take the class at night. Is that really fair? So that's the territory we're getting into, which is the tighter we cut it, the fewer options we have. And do you want to pass on those options, restrictions to students and families?
Did you want to reply to this? And then
A
we'll
little
go back
bit,
to Guy.
related to Guy's point, I just wanted to say, I think the more we have to think about doing that and limiting our options, it's sort of the opposite of what Matt pointed out earlier. We are becoming a district where there is at least the possibility of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more we limit, the more we have a potential to impact enrollment, the more that impacts our funding. So I think we have to be really thoughtful about how we structure a program in line with our strategic initiatives and in line with what I really do think the community wants, which is a really robust program that continues to offer excellence.
And I've heard the committee's frustrations this year in the way we approach budget. We have been basically asked to design to a number.
Yeah.
Not propose a program.
Guy,
That's
go ahead.
Right. So please, I'm not talking about limiting anything. I'm talking about looking for opportunities to provide the service in a different way that would be more, cost efficient. So please don't think that I'm suggesting some limitation or in the excellence of the education that we're going to provide. That's not my message. My question and my thought was, is there a way that we can provide that same service in a more efficient way?
Understood.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions or comments, Guy?
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate you sticking with us. Next in the chat is Jody Harris, Essex.
Hi, thank you for
Jody.
giving me the opportunity. Can you give me what our E&D was for the last 4 years?
Avi's nodding, so.
Yep.
I can't see Avi, so.
Yeah, sorry. Give me 1 second. I'm just pulling up the
okay.
numbers. So I just have a couple of the years right in front of me. 1.578 million in 21, 1.778 in 20. So it went down about 200,000 from 2021. 1.776 in 19. So that was pretty much even with fiscal 20. We don't have the 22 number yet, and I can pull up fiscal 18 in just a moment. But I would say pretty even. And then the forecast for 22 is just based off the fact that we have that $500,000 number baked in there. So we'll have an update on that probably within a few weeks. And I will look for the 18 and 17 numbers for you in just a minute.
Okay, great. So I guess my comment is in 2020, the school committee committed $100,000 from your reserves, but got a return of E&D of $1.7 million. And then the next year,
No.
2021, is that right?
Can I clarify that? No, because the number 1.776 in fiscal 19 and 1.778 in fiscal 20, that basically tells you there was zero return. So it tells you that the balance was unchanged. So if there was a return, for example, of, let's just say $300,000, you'd go from 1.7 million up to 2 million. The total number is a multi-year accumulation, and precisely because they are one-time funds, we don't expect the number to change unless something happens. You get savings that exceed, your spending, it goes up, vice versa if it goes down.
So you were giving me balances. I was asking about what did you get into your, what was your E and D number?
I see.
Exactly, annually.
Yeah, so the DOR just certifies the balance number. That's how they certify it. And we can tell you what the change is if that's what you'd like. And that's what I'm attempting to do. So it basically did not change from 19 to 20, and it went down from 20 to 21 by about $200,000.
Okay, so the $200,000 between 20 and 21 is off.
Yep.
So I'm just looking at the offsets. The offset for that, is that the 330 in 21, or is it the 100,000 in 2020?
The 21 number would include the number that you have, the DOR sets aside the amount that you have budgeted for the next year. So the 21 number includes the fact that when they certified 21, we already had a budget out that was published for 22 that had 335,000. So that's what, so it went down partly because because of the 335,000. It also went up a little less. Maybe we didn't use the full amount.
Okay, I guess that's what I'm trying to drill down to is what did you actually use in reserves? You committed them during the budgeting process, but what did you
200,000.
actually?
200,000 between 20 and 21. And
Okay.
between 19 and 20, the balance didn't change. And I can provide the prior year numbers too shortly. I'm just pulling them up on the
Okay.
fly.
So between 19 and 20, you committed the $100,000, but the balance didn't change. So essentially, your $100,000 that was committed to the budget wasn't actually expended.
Materialized.
Indirectly, I think that's a fair summary.
Is that a fair summary? I'm just
At a very high level, because there are a lot of other factors that go in. For example, if there's a deficit in any other fund that's outside of the budget, that will impact your excess and deficiency number, because they'll take essentially your fund balance in the general fund, but let's just say you have a program, let's say your food service program is in deficit, which it has been. That's going to reduce your E&D because the Department of Revenue is saying, you might have 1.7, but we see you've got $100,000 deficit in the food service account, so we're certifying 1.6 because taxpayers are going to have to eat that bill at some point, or you'll come up with some way to deal with it, but we're telling you that your balance has to be reduced to account for that deficit. So it's not just about what we use, it's also about what's happening outside of the budget. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I think that's just important to keep in mind.
No, I understand. I just think at the end of the day, we really do need to understand when the school committee is committing your reserves, are they actually being used, or are they cycling back as E&D the following year? So I guess that leads me to my next question, and this is, probably a little in the weeds, but what's your policy regarding budgeting at a line item level?
Tell me more what you're asking. I'm not
So
sure.
for instance, I have a $100,000 line item. I underspend that by $90,000. Are you starting that line item in your next budget season at 100 plus your 3.5%?
Great question. So I think you're introducing the concept of zero-based budgeting. And so if you watch some of our budget presentations, I'm not sure if you have over the recent years, there have been many years where we've gone into zero-based budgeting for many different areas of our budget, including staffing. So for example, one of the ways we achieve level services, if there's like say an enrollment decline, is to look at how many staff we have and to say we may not need that staffing. So the reduction of 4 FTE for the fiscal 24 budget would be an example of saying, it's not just going to carry forward the same number. What do we actually need? Out of district is another area where we go name by name. Health insurance is another area where we might have, for example, a 12% rate increase, but we're looking at the fiscal 23 current year actual projection, which we did in our November meeting, where we did a budget to actual analysis for the current year and a forecast through the end of the year to say, there's going to be some savings in this year, so we can take that 12% rate increase, but it'll be off a lower base, so that it might only turn into 10%. So yes, absolutely, that is something we're going through each year. And the reason is because we're trying to achieve the same outcome as taxpayers are, which is how do we fit our budget and our program within a constrained amount of revenue? If we didn't do that, we would be even higher. And so this is one of the ways that we come as close to possible as the levy limit each year is by doing exactly what you're suggesting.
Yeah, it's becoming very tough. I'm concerned about the declining student population. You know, we've seen it's cyclical. We all know that. When we started the district, fewer than 50% of the population, school age population of students in Manchester attended the district. So today, do we know of the student age population in each town, what percentage are attending our public schools?
Not by town, but in total, it's approximately an 85-25 split with variations at the different grade levels, as low as 9% attending outside of the district in like the second and third grade, escalates to about the mid-teens by the end of grade school, early middle school, and will escalate again 8th to 9th to on average about 25%. But we've been discussing tonight, we saw a spike last year and we're closer to 30%.
So do we have, I'm sure you do have a
That grade
document that
level, not
shows
in
that
total. So that would
historically,
average out to about 20.
Sorry, Jody, she's still talking, so I just want to make sure we hear you both. Go ahead.
That's okay, go ahead.
All right, go ahead, Jody. Could you repeat
I'm
that?
just wondering, I think the tough part of this budgeting process for Essex is that we are constantly seeking data. And I think we need to memorialize some of this data in documents so that when FinComs change over and school committee members change over, they can look at historical documents and see these trends and share them amongst themselves instead of coming back to the school committee all the time for the same information year over year. That's just a suggestion that I have been listening to these calls and listening to the finance committee and having been on the school committee. I think that data, all my decisions are data driven. Most of yours are. And I think that if we commit those to documents that are shared with both towns and we just build on those documents with your annual data, I think it's going to help trending. And, you know, Ben talks about it all the time. And with Essex being on the, you know, sort of the heavy end of the apportionment right now, clearly we're struggling, but it's a struggle that I think that the town knows that it is important. And if we all kind of take ourselves back to 1999 when we were trying to form this district, you know, Manchester was struggling with, you know, 50 kids in a class or less, and couldn't sustain any kind of rich program without a partner. So, you know, I understand, you know, we need to work collaboratively, but we also, there are limited resources. And until we find ways in Essex to bring in more revenue, we're going to continue to have these discussions. And I want to make sure that we keep it on the positive. And I think that's, I guess, because of that, I am strongly suggesting that we continue to share more documents that allow committee members, you know, if they change year over year or they're on a committee for 10 years, that they're not asking you the same questions over and over. So, and I think it's important that we break down student population by town, you know, potential population versus actual attending, because although they're all Manchester Essex Regional School students, it makes a difference from a budgeting perspective for each town to know what the apportionment is going forward. And I guess my last question is, so we always talk about program cuts because that's what happens when we're coming into a tough budget year and we need to cut program. In the past couple of years, when we have been told that programs were cut, did they actually get cut? I mean, I heard that, you know, Spanish was cut to, you know, one less day a week, or did we make it work in some other way so that we didn't have to cut as deeply as was spoken about at budget hearings.
I think Pam can answer that pretty straightforwardly. Go ahead.
There were several reorganizations last year in the budget and 2 specific cuts. The cut was to elementary Spanish and 6th grade Spanish. Those teachers were laid off. And we also cut the late bus. There is no late bus service.
So to clarify,
yes.
Jody, that 1 day a week was for every elementary school classroom. That was there.
That's how
that program worked. But yes, the programs were indeed cut.
They were cut by 1 day a week or cut entirely?
There is no. The program
That was the
1 day a
program.
week.
That was the program. Okay, perfect.
It's a special like art or music. So, yeah.
And I know you have busing issues. Everybody has busing issues. How many students are actually utilizing the bus service?
That was an actual positive last year. We were able to consolidate routes and get some savings from that. So.
Oh, good.
Probably.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull up that data. It's declined a little bit over the past couple of years, just as enrollment has. And so part of what we did this year is we reduced the number of buses that we're running. And that was a $50,000 budget savings. That ended up being a little bit higher than that in actual.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jody. And the last person we have in round 1 is Tina Lane from Essex. Tina, can you unmute yourself?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Tina.
Yeah, I just have one question. That was a good one, Jody. I was wondering if you can share how many choice students receive special ed services, and do we get reimbursed from the state the same amount of money for a typical student for special
Thank you, Tina. Go ahead.
So we don't break out who's on student on an IEP in any way on for individualized populations for confidentiality reasons as required. We have just over 60 school choice kids in the district currently. And we do have out of district placements get fully reimbursed by the sending community 1 year in arrears. So we have to wait a year, but it gets charged to the school choice fund, which is outside of the budget. So we're able to float that for a year. And for kids who get services in district, there is an increment over the base 5,000 that you can submit for, which we do, such that our average, per pupil revenue is probably closer to, 6,500, something like that, factoring out the tuition costs.
Okay, so you get somewhat reimbursed for it.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my question. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tina, I appreciate it. Thanks for hanging in. Okay, that concludes round 1, folks. It is indeed 9:34. What's that? Oh, phone. I'm sorry, I did say. Is anyone calling on the phone who cannot put their name in the chat who would like to engage? If so, please unmute yourself.
There are no phone callers left.
They gave up, bless their hearts. So typically, this isn't how long this would go. This is a public hearing and this is worthwhile. I mean, in terms of a school committee meeting. So I am going to invite a round 2, but I'm going to ask us all to consider the time and everybody's engagement level. We do enter a point of diminishing returns after a certain point. So knowing that we can always continue the conversation outside of here, you are always welcome to contact any of the school committee members. And I know Pam and Avi have been very generous with their time and energy answering questions as well. So I will open it to people in the room. Does anyone have any? Yes, go ahead, Ruth.
Say, of course. Everyone saw that, right?
Of course.
They're gonna come off and on. So I'm gonna just do this once, and mine's more of a comment. So I want to start with huge appreciation to Pam and Albie and the entire school committee. I know how much dedication you guys all put into this, the time, the effort, the energy, and I'm sorry I'm keeping you from sleep. But one of the reason I want to make this comment is I so respect every time we have a meeting and I hear Pam say this. In everyone in this room will not understand, doesn't have the historical perspective to understand where this is going. Ann Harrison, Jeff Soulard, and Pam and Avi are the only ones in this room that can understand where we were in 2016, 2017, 2017, 2018. So while we've been having this conversation since 2019 forward that Essex is struggling and, financially it's a burden and we're just so overwhelmed by this, I want to point something out. So I have some statistics because data is, driving this conversation. We are currently poised toward a 5.4% assessment, right? So that's in our 3.5, which is our ceiling that we've talked about as a district. Having said that, in 2016 and 17, when Manchester was on the high end, the highest assessment they saw was 3.32. We're at 5.4. And I also, where I respect Pam so much, is she always does these conversations where she says, right now Essex is feeling the pinch, but it used to be Manchester. And I'm bringing that up because basically, other than 4 people in this room, Essex is like, there's this gray cloud above us, like, oh my God, how can they not want to fund this school? Or, we want to fund it, but why so much pushback? And it's the numbers, it's the data, it's a struggle. And that's why. And I'm just going to say, it will shift. It will go back to Manchester at some point, and we will be in this same room, and we will hear this from the other side.
Yep.
So thank you for your time. That's my only comment. But I think it's important for people to look at some of the old numbers and realize that this was on the other side.
Yeah.
And we want to pass this budget, and we want to work with the district because it's our district, and it's our kids that are getting educated. And then I'm also going to throw my hat in the ring for support. The reason that we would be passionate for a one-time capital expense like the turf fields not being part of the budget, as we know, we build our budget on the previous year's budget. So when we look for $1 million for turf fields next year in our school budget, that's the start of our first school budget, right? It's that $1 million that we grow on top of instead of just cutting off the $1 million, replacing a field, and then our budget doesn't start there. So throwing my 2 cents in that I support that one-time capital expense.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think it is fair to say, I'll hold my comments, please. Thank you, Ben.
No, I was just actually building on what Ruthie is saying, and that is from the town perspective, the issue that we're facing is not contemplating whether to enhance or degrade the program. Even if you think status quo and you map that to a 3.5%, I think, and this is really a message for the school committee, which is that the issue for Essex is a capacity issue. And the school is 50% of our budget. The levy limit's 2.5%. Even a vanilla 3.5% budget with the apportionment comes in at 5%. So if you do the math, we have to flatline the entire town budget to pay for the school. So right now, and I'm mapping that out over the next 3 to 5 years. We don't have the capacity to pay for the school, and that's the issue that we're facing. So it's not really it's helpful if we know where the town stands, which is why I think the override is actually helpful because, the residents have to make that decision. But I mean, it's right now, we don't have the capacity to do it. So I think it's just important that people understand that it's a structural problem. So that's why we go through this every year and we have the same conversation because, the math doesn't happen. So.
All I was going to share on that is in the frustration I express isn't lack of understanding. I intellectually understand the problem and I understand the flip, and we're problem solvers, so we can give you solutions. I think the school as an entity ends up in the middle and unable to truly meet our direct constituents' needs and wants, because those inputs don't always align with the ability to pay, and to be in the middle between brokering a deal between the 2 towns. So our energy shifts from managing the program to kind of managing this conversation. And we want to be willing partners. And I can speak only for myself and for how we work today, and even our recent conversations, we want to be partners in it, but I don't think we hold the keys to the solution. Because we do keep coming up every year and we have the 3 different inputs. You're not investing enough, you're not expanding the programs, you're always building to level services. It doesn't sound inspiring. I'm aware of that. but yet it does sound responsible if you're worried about how you're going to make a 5% number work. So we're kind of left with this mess that doesn't, it's not working for the schools, or if we're talking about building forward, because the conversation gets back to just solving the problem. It's nobody's fault. But it's a collective answer. There is no one entity in this room that can solve the problem. And I think some of it does very honestly come down to commitments that the two towns made and in reconciling the sets of expectations and wants.
And my concern with that is that we hear, it kind of goes back to what Caroline was saying, we hear so much and spend so much energy talking about this when you say from the town side, but that's the town leadership side, the people who have to make the numbers work. But then there's the actual citizens of the town as well.
Mhm.
And we hear more about the program things from our Manchester community members, or at least I do, than from our Essex community members, because it's just sort of, everyone's just sort of going about their business. So part of what I care about in this is making sure that we're actually representing what the entire town needs to get at, what everybody is looking for here, and then making the numbers work also, because I'm not sure we're getting, I'm not sure we're always hearing all the voices we need to, but that's an outreach and communication issue as well. I know that our community or our committee members are doing the best we can to try to have those conversations and continue to get that input. So we are always grateful for that, but that is an ongoing thing. But again, I'm not known for being optimistic, but we do have a change in tone. There's a change in tone that feels much more collaborative this year than it has the past couple. And I think we are poised to actually move forward with some solutions as we get through some of this. Did you have one more? Go ahead.
Just,
Matt.
first of all, this has been a
Matt
good
Gibbs.
discussion. Cam, I appreciate your passion in articulating the challenge that you have. And you said something I just want to circle back to. You said that the charter or the ask of you has been this 3.5%, right? So every department, in every community, Essex and Manchester, has a similar ask, right, from FinCom, to be able to meet some target, right? And I think, as best I understand it, that, that's possible in some departments and it's not possible. It was brought up about Essex Police have said, okay, we'll live with 2%, right? That's a decision thing. I would challenge you a little bit to not accept that. And I don't know the dynamics of the school committee and what you're tasked with doing. And I know that you don't want to accept that. My dad was an assistant principal. I know many superintendents. They're close friends of his. I understand. I don't know why you do it. But I would challenge the board and you to educate the community on what you said, because I understand. And I understand what you said. I understand all of this, but the community, I don't think, generally speaking, does understand how we have to go about that and what the cost of it would be. And I'm not one to propose state problems without a solution. I don't know how you fix that, and I'll maybe think about that a little bit more. But I think understanding that process, because you also said something that I picked up on, which was the risk of going to town meeting with the ask of an override and it not passing, right? So I think the community needs to understand that too, right? So if we approve a budget that doesn't require an override, that's going to guarantee kind of services, right? That we all know and understand. We go to town meeting to enhance services. There's a chance that doesn't pass, and what does that mean? I don't know the answer to that, but I think the community probably should understand that. But Erica's point, if we're going to try and increase services because we want, better arts programs or STEM, we all know how the world's changing and can't invest enough in STEM. So if the administrators are coming to you and saying, hey, I need an additional FTE for a STEM program, I don't know that the community understands how that all works, or they feel part of that decision. I certainly don't know how that works. But I think what I'm fearful from this meeting is this was a very tactical meeting about numbers. I've sat through a million of these, and everybody like Ravi does an amazing job because you spent all your time on this. But it's just numbers, and it's you just explained to me how you're going to meet a budget, which every FinCom does every year and every town across the country. I don't think that's what the community is looking for. At this point in time, I think they're looking for something more than that. And you've expressed 13 years of
Mhm.
the same stuff. I would challenge that anybody who's been doing
Okay.
multiple boards is doing the same thing for 13 years. Same result, we should do it differently.
The one thing I just want to call attention to, and I think this is something maybe I have a particular vantage point to, and I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
What the community wants is different in both towns.
Right.
So the argument and the ask that and it's not a judgment on, it's just different, right? So I hear you, I feel you, but that that approach may not be what the acceptable approach to the other communities. So the communities need to be asked the questions differently. And they have different expectations. So that's why I keep coming back to, and I'm not punting on this, but there is going back to Chris's phrase that's stuck with me, a misalignment of expectations between the two communities. And we're being put in the position of trying to solve for it, where if we make an argument to suit Manchester, we may alienate Essex. And if we make an argument to meet Essex's need, we may alienate Manchester. And we can't get a budget tactical because we can't have a budget without two town votes. You may vote yes, aspirational budget, and it gets no. That's a no. We have nothing going forward. And we have to start the process all over again. So it's tactical to a degree, not because we wouldn't be preferring to sit here and talking and rolling out new programming to you. It's tactical because there is a lot to lose if we can't guarantee at least rolling forward what we have now. And I hear you, and I'm going to think a lot about how we can message some of this more, but it's a really tough spot to be in. Sorry, choked on my own words there.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to say that I don't think that it's an issue of the two communities wanting different things. I think that it is an issue of the two communities being able to provide for those things, because I think that everybody in Essex wants the same level of education that everybody in Manchester wants. The town of Essex had 8% of its population report income levels below the federal poverty line the last time the US Census put out an estimate. 8%, that's almost 1 in 10 households in Essex. We are different communities. I don't want to alienate Essex. I don't want us to be the ones with the rain cloud over our heads. But if the financial means are not there, we can create as many aspirations as we want, but we don't have a plan to support them. And so we have to be realistic that, it's the sad reality of it, right? It's weighing the needs of our communities with what we want to be.
And we have to be collaborative. I mean,
Right.
This is not something that you can solve. This has to be solved between the two towns. That's all we can do. Yeah. Thank you. I saw Nina, and then I'll go to
be
Ann.
really quick. I think, Pam, it was something you had said, and it's pulling off of different meetings and stuff. But even when you said, like, asking a student, like, would they want to take a class at 5 p.m.? There could be students who want to do that. And so I guess I'd say I'm speaking for myself, speaking to this, it's about seeing that creativity. I think, not to put Jake on the spot, but probably 2 years ago during COVID, when he would write in, like, there's things that we've learned, we saw. I speak for myself, I don't want to just keep seeing the same thing, like a $30 million budget at the same thing, where I look at it, we're small, we should be able to be flexible, we should be able to be nimble, we should be able to be creative, but not have that have to be more expensive. My daughter takes French. If there's only 6 kids in French 4, put them online, or figure something out. I'm just saying, like, there's just a way I look at it as how do we try to balance the majority, 43 singleton classes. So that is a tremendous amount of us, like, looking at a schedule that I keep hearing from the high school level, and I know I've said to certain people individually that high school is where people have to look at. Maybe that's why people have had shifts from 8th to 9th grade. But we 43 singleton classes. So think about how much looking at the budget schedule. We have a schedule that's been in place since 2015 or 16. Do we have to look at the schedule? Do we have to be creative? And I don't think creativity adds a price tag. And so I think that's where some people are looking at it, especially then if you don't have the knowledge we all have of
decline in enrollment and other things. They just see random data facts, they only are showing at the town meeting.
Yep.
So again, it's an education process. The other thing I will quickly add, all the towns and stuff, well, all the towns or both towns have to figure out, because the reason everybody might in Manchester talk about is there is a perception that the school's in Manchester. There's a perception that everything's just done in Manchester. I've had friends whose kids that, they hosted the team for the XYZ team dinner. Kids in Manchester complained that they had to drive to Essex to go to a team dinner. So it's sort of a mixture of, in that lower school grades in second grade, I think my son played basketball. The school tried to make it a mixed team. Kids in Manchester, parents complained about having to go to the Essex gym for basketball. So and that's not on school, except it's a cultural component built within, that's obviously saying build on, but that is what's happening. It's even happening now. And that is something that as two towns, we have to figure out, because obviously we're always going to keep butting heads to this. Because for every single parent in Manchester that thinks it's a big deal going to Essex, just think of all of the times any parent with 3 kids in Essex might be coming to Manchester to help or do anything, and it just sort of put it in perspective.
I'd like to respond to that briefly. So I'm an Essex representative. I'm part of this Essex group of people who have to do the driving and this, that, and the other. And I would submit, though, that I think that part of our culture needs to shift toward recognizing that there's give and take from both sides, because I also hear an equal number of complaints from Essex people driving to Manchester for everything. I do. I really hear all of that. And so I really, at this level, at a personal, anecdotal level, that I don't want to account for, but at this level, I just want to be clear that having 2 towns in a district is having 2 towns in a district. I do think that the linchpin to this is getting EES done. Is once we have new building and people aren't looking so longingly at the lovely buildings in Manchester and the right, good, wonderful things that have been built here first for reasons that were outside of our control, then that's going to be a big component of it. There will be opportunity when we're designing Essex Elementary School to look at things that might be able to encourage cross-district interaction. But this is still a really young district, and we have a lot of moving forward to do all together about that. And I just want to be careful not to overgeneralize with that. And the other thing is that, the same thing, getting the same thing for an increasing budget, the same thing is pretty good. It's a pretty good education. There are things to improve, but our kids are coming out with good outcomes. At the same time, we're coming out of the COVID years, and I don't know that right now is the best time for us to argue toward putting kids back in online classes. Now that we're actually seeing what some of the results from remote schooling were, it seems like when we're talking about the budget, we want to talk about moving toward these things, but then when we talk about outcomes and what we want for our kids, those things were not the best idea. So I want to bring this back I will see if anybody else has comments, but as we start to think about closing, to remember that this is the beginning. We're in the beginning of this process. We do have a lot of good opportunity ahead of us to build the bridges, but this is early. This is very early in this year, but it's also early. We still have a lot to go to truly integrate these 2 communities into a combined collaborative district. Anyone else? Go ahead, Erica.
I just want to add one more point of just positivity, because you touched on something I think is really important and it should be important throughout this process, and that's the positive outcomes. And I think about this when I see or hear conversations in the community about exodus from the school, like what are our outcomes? And the one thing I think we could think about doing a little bit more of is taking pride in them and publicizing them. And I don't even know what I mean, but this school does do a fantastic job. And we do have kids going off and doing incredible things, service opportunities, incredible schools. I don't feel like people always know that. In fact, I don't know that. So I think, that's another thing we can do to just kind of build the pride in this district. And as we think about the budgets and all these other things that are harder and complicated and the town relationships, like let's celebrate that a little bit. And I think that would be good for all of us.
Anyone else? Thank you, Nina. Anne, did you have your hand up earlier? Did you want to say something?
Picture of two towns that are very different. Each town is significantly split. You've got strong school supporters in Essex who want to see great programs. And you've got people in Manchester who don't want to spend another nickel. So just think about that when you're thinking about how you're doing the presenting, and do present to both sides and let them know that we understand. And that the two cases really aren't that different. It's just that Manchester parents seem to use their voices.
Thank you. Anyone else in person? Okay, is there anyone left online that would like to make a final comment or question? Seeing no one, I will invite anyone from the committee. Would anyone from the committee like to make any final comments or questions? Go ahead, Jake.
So process-wise, it sounds like this is a time to articulate a little bit of next step. It sounds like our budget conversations are going to be reliant on kind of a 3 to 5 year projection or window to know kind of what we're asking for now and what the intentions are for the towns. I'm hearing support from the towns in terms of, this is the moment to try to correct it, right? I don't hear them saying, go back and, 2% or nothing, right? I don't hear that at all. But our ask can't just look at next year. So our next conversation, and, obviously it sounds like you have a modeling process that would be useful to maybe engage us with or let us explore. But it seems like for our next conversation, we need to look at that longer term projections.
Yeah.
Because I'm
I agree.
I'm nervous about EES, right? There's going to be unanticipated expenses there and likely elsewhere. And I think as I'm coming to understand it, this 3.5% assumption, apportionment growth assumption, basically holds up year to year, but doesn't hold up long term. And so how likely do we trust that, 3 to 5 years out? If we have an unanticipated expense, that's what seems to get us in the a need for an override or a correction every 6 years or so, 7 years. And I think we've pretty well raised the question about, what do we mean by level services and what do we mean by excellent schools? And so to your point of sharing outcomes, I don't think we have metrics or outcomes that we track to determine whether or not we're excellent yet, right? Really, we only talk about MCAS or, kids going off to college maybe, but, graduation rate, whatever it may be. But I think we need to decide what those are so we can communicate them and track that. And then use those to determine whether or not our program is the right thing for those outcomes.
Go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Go ahead.
But I'll just say that this is my first year here, and I feel, as the people on the school committee knows, that I'm always pushing for more transparency and whatnot, because I do, and it sounds like during this budget process at least, if we can be more transparent with everybody, so people understand more about where everybody's coming from, that seems to be, that would help. And also in the budget presentation, when the town is voting, I know that we talk about specific data that's been presented at a specific date. I think it sounds like if we can do a better job to kind of capture all the information in an easier to understand way, not just to go through the data, that might also help for people to understand. So data transparency and data communication.
I think I want to comment just briefly on the transparency thing, because I think that there's a little bit of, I don't even think it's confusion, but a change in what that means, for our communities over the past couple of years. So transparency might mean access to the information, and it's published and it's all, listed and accessible and everything. But what people have been referring to as transparency for the last couple of years, and I think it's continuing, is more managerial level information that wouldn't typically be published stuff, or even things like, how many classes have less than, 10 kids in them, that sort of thing. That's not necessarily stuff that would be presented upon and discussed at such at this level of things. That's more what they handle day to day. I'm not arguing against it. I'm just saying that as we ask for those things and as we come to expect different kinds of reporting from our administrators, we need to just give a little bit of leeway of understanding that as we do this, it takes more of their time and energy, and those are finite resources, the amount of time. So I agree, and I appreciate that. I just want to counsel anybody who's listening to recognize that there's a shift, and not everything is just, easily accessible. But thank you. Any other school committee members wish to make comment at this point? Pam or Avi, would you like to say anything in closing?
No, thank you for your time.
Okay, then I will thank everyone also for being here. Thank you. Yep. I will thank you all for being here in person and online. Thanks to our committee members for sticking it out for well, I don't know if it's a record from the COVID years, but it's a pretty long one tonight. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
That's unanimous. We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, nice meeting you.